The bitter Wyoming wind howled across the Bighorn Mountains, driving snow in horizontal sheets against the small log cabin nestled among the pines. Inside, the fire had dwindled to embers, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. A woman with copper skin and raven hair sat motionless beside the dying flames, her dark eyes fixed on the door as if willing it to open. Sophia Reyes had been waiting for 3 days. 3 days since she'd picked the simple lock and claimed this stranger's home as sanctuary. 3 days of listening to the wind's mournful song while contemplating the choices that had led her here. Her fingers absently traced the worn harmonica in her pocket, a talisman from another life. The sudden crash of the cabin door nearly startled her to her feet, but years of practiced composure kept her seated, only her eyes betraying alarm as a mountain of a man stumbled through the opening snow and blood spattering the threshold in equal measure. Nathaniel Hargrove stood 6 feet tall in his boots, though at present he was hunched over in pain. His weathered face was pale beneath a week's growth of salt and pepper beard, and his sheepskin coat was stained with a spreading crimson patch just below the right shoulder. The revolver in his hand shook slightly, but his blue eyes remained sharp, despite the obvious blood loss immediately locking onto the stranger by his fire. "Don't move," he growled, raising the Colt despite the tremor in his arm. Sophia did not flinch. She observed the wounded man with clinical detachment, noting the way he braced himself against the doorframe, how his breathing came in shallow gasps that misted in the cold air rushing through the open door. "Sit down, Mr. Hargrove," she said calmly. "That wound will kill you if it's not treated." Confusion flickered across Nate's face, quickly replaced by suspicion. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, the gun wavering but not lowering. "Close the door first," Sophia replied, nodding toward the swirling snow beyond. "You're letting out what little heat remains." For a moment, they held each other's gaze, his filled with pain and mistrust, hers with an unsettling certainty. Then, as if the decision had been made for him, Nate's knees buckled. He caught himself against the wall, leaving a smear of blood on the rough logs. With effort, he kicked the door closed behind him, though the gun remained pointed in her direction. "Who are you?" he asked, voice ragged. "Someone who can save your life." Sophia rose slowly, hands visible at her sides. "And perhaps the only person within 50 miles who can properly clean that bullet wound." Nate took an unsteady step forward, intending to maintain distance between them, but the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his shoulder. The cabin tilted around him, the woman's face blurring as darkness crept into the edges of his vision. "How do you—" he began, but never finished the question. The gun clattered to the floor as Nathaniel Hargrove pitched forward into unconsciousness. Fever dreams pulled Nate through swirling darkness. He was back in the high desert, the summer sun beating down as he rode point for his unit. Then suddenly, he was in the valley, smoke rising from the village, screams echoing through the cottonwoods. Children running, blood on his hands. Always blood. "Shadow Valley," he muttered, thrashing against unseen restraints. "The children! The children!" Cool fingers pressed against his forehead, a soft voice murmuring words he couldn't understand. Not English, not Spanish, something older that seemed to flow like water over stones. The touch anchored him, pulling him back from the edge of the nightmare. When Nate finally opened his eyes, the cabin was bathed in gray morning light. He lay on his bedroll near the now roaring fire, stripped to the waist, with his right shoulder and chest wrapped in clean bandages. The pain had subsided to a dull throb, and the fever had broken. He felt weak but clear-headed for the first time in what must have been days. The woman sat cross-legged beside him, grinding something in a small stone mortar. The aroma of medicinal herbs filled the air, bitter and astringent, but not unpleasant. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple braid, revealing high cheekbones and a straight nose. Not beautiful, in the conventional sense, but striking a face that commanded attention. "You've been unconscious for 2 days," she said without looking up. "The bullet passed through clean, but infection had already set in. You're fortunate I was here." Nate attempted to sit up, wincing at the pull of stitches in his shoulder. "Who shot me?" The woman's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their rhythmic grinding. "I imagine the same people hunting me." She set aside the mortar and finally met his gaze. "My name is Sophia Reyes." "That doesn't answer my question," Nate replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "How do you know who I am? Why are you in my home?" Sophia rose and moved to the small table where she'd arranged her supplies, bandages, bottles, and herbs that weren't his. She poured water from a kettle into a cup and mixed in some of the ground herbs. "Drink this," she said, returning to kneel beside him. "It will help with the pain and prevent the fever from returning." Nate made no move to take the offered cup. "I asked you a question." A slight smile touched Sophia's lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Actually, you asked 3, and I will answer them all, Mr. Hargrove. But first you need to drink this, or we'll have wasted my efforts to keep you alive." They stared at each other for a long moment, a silent battle of wills. Finally, Nate reached for the cup with his good arm. "If you wanted me dead," he conceded, "you've had ample opportunity." The liquid was bitter and earthy with undertones of mint, and something he couldn't identify. Nate grimaced but drained the cup. "Good," Sophia said, taking the empty vessel. "Now rest. There's a storm building outside, the worst of the season from the feel of it. We have time for explanations." As if on cue, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's single window. Nate settled back, his body demanding sleep, despite his mind's unease. The last thing he saw before his eyes closed was Sophia returning to her place by the fire, her profile outlined in amber light as she began sharpening a small knife with practiced strokes. When Nate awoke again, night had fallen. The cabin was warm, filled with the savory aroma of something cooking. His mouth watered, reminding him he hadn't eaten properly in days. He managed to sit up fully this time, noting with surprise that the pain in his shoulder had diminished considerably. Sophia stood at the small cast-iron stove, stirring a pot of what appeared to be rabbit stew. She'd evidently made herself at home, finding his stores and cooking supplies without difficulty. "Your traps yielded dinner," she said without turning around. "Hope you don't mind." Nate swung his legs over the edge of the bedroll and tested his strength. Wobbly, but he could stand. "You seem to have made yourself quite comfortable in my absence," he observed, reaching for a shirt draped over the back of a chair. Putting it on was a painful process, but he preferred being clothed for whatever conversation lay ahead. Circumstances demanded it. Sophia ladled stew into 2 bowls and brought one to him. "Can you manage, or do you need help?" Nate took the bowl with his good hand. "I've survived worse." They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the howling wind outside and the occasional pop of the fire. The stew was surprisingly good, better than Nate's own cooking, though he wouldn't admit it. "You cook well," he said finally, setting aside his empty bowl. "My mother taught me," Sophia replied. She believed food should heal the body and spirit. Nate studied her in the firelight. There was something familiar about her features, though he couldn't place it. "Your mother, she was Comanche." Sophia's eyebrows raised slightly. "Yes, though I'm curious how you knew that. The herbs you used on my wound, the grinding technique, not Apache or Navajo methods." Nate shifted, trying to find a comfortable position. I spent time among many tribes during my years as a scout. You learn to recognize the differences. You were more than a scout. Sergeant Hargrove, Sophia said quietly. You were an interpreter, one of the few white men who bothered to learn our languages, our ways. The use of his former military rank sent a chill through Nate that had nothing to do with his wound. You still haven't told me how you know who I am or why you're here. Sophia set her own bowl aside and met his gaze directly. I know you were part of the 5th Cavalry under Colonel Mackenzie. I know you served as interpreter and scout during the campaigns against the Comanche and Apache. I know you left the Army 8 years ago after an incident. She paused. An incident that haunts your dreams still. Nate's jaw tightened. You've been asking questions about me. Why? Because you're one of the few men alive who might understand what I'm trying to do. She rose and moved to her pack in the corner, retrieving a folded paper. And because there are people who want us both dead for the same reason. She handed him the paper, a wanted bulletin, with her face sketched upon it. $500 for information, $1,000 for her capture. The charges, espionage and murder of U.S. Army personnel. I'm not a spy, she said as he studied the paper. But the murder charge, that part is accurate. Nate looked up sharply. You killed soldiers, 3 of them. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes flashed with a cold fury. They were deserters, turned bandits, who preyed on isolated homesteads, especially those of mixed families or Indians living off the reservations. They raped and murdered at least 4 women that I know of. When I found them about to do the same to a 14-year-old girl, she shrugged. I made a choice I would make again. And now someone powerful wants you silenced. It wasn't a question. The men had powerful friends, one in particular a former officer now pursuing political ambitions. He can't afford to have his connection to them exposed. Sophia reclaimed the wanted bulletin. He's hired experienced men to find me. Men who know how to track, how to kill. And one of them shot me, Nate concluded. Mistook me for someone helping you. Sophia's expression tightened. Perhaps, or perhaps they know exactly who you are and what you know. Before Nate could respond, a violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, making the timbers creak in protest. The storm outside had intensified, bringing with it the promise of several feet of new snow. We're not going anywhere for at least a week, Nate said, glancing toward the window where ice crystals had formed in intricate patterns. So we have time for you to tell me the real reason you sought me out. No more half-truths, Ms. Reyes. I want the whole story. Sophia stared into the fire for a long moment. Very well, she said finally. But first I think we could both use something stronger than tea. She retrieved a bottle of whiskey from Nate's cupboard, his emergency supply, and poured 2 fingers into tin cups. Handing one to Nate, she raised her own slightly. To unlikely alliances, she said, her eyes never leaving his. Nate didn't drink. I haven't agreed to any alliance. You will, Sophia replied with quiet certainty. Once you hear what I have to say about Shadow Valley. The name hit Nate like a physical blow. Shadow Valley, the code name for an operation few knew about, and fewer spoke of. The darkest chapter of his military career buried in classified reports and nightmares. How do you know that name? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia's smile held no warmth. Because I was there, Sergeant Hargrove. I was one of the children you saved. The wind moaned through the night, a fitting accompaniment to the ghosts Sophia's words had summoned. Nate sat motionless, the untouched whiskey forgotten in his hand, as she spoke of things he'd spent 8 years trying to forget. Shadow Valley wasn't its real name, of course, Sophia continued. To the Comanche who lived there for generations, it was Mumui Kuka Yoahyopu Valley of Morning Shadows, a reference to the way the sun rose over the eastern ridge, casting long shadows across the valley floor. Her voice took on a lyrical quality, as if reciting something memorized long ago. A sacred place where the spirits of the ancestors spoke through the wind in the cottonwoods. "I remember," Nate said softly, "the trees along the creek, like nothing else in that desert." Sophia nodded, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Most soldiers didn't notice such things. I wasn't most soldiers. Nate finally took a sip of whiskey, welcoming its burn. "You said you were there. How the village was—" He couldn't finish. "Destroyed. Yes." Sophia's fingers tightened around her cup. "I was 14. My mother was Comanche, my father not. I was visiting my mother's family that summer while my father was stationed elsewhere. When the attack came, I was gathering medicinal plants with my grandmother near the stream." She paused, staring into the amber liquid as if it might contain the right words. "We heard the shots, saw the smoke. My grandmother pushed me into a hollow beneath the riverbank and covered me with her body. She was killed there, shielding me." Sophia's voice remained even though her knuckles had turned white around the cup. "I lay beneath her body for hours, too terrified to move, listening to the screams, then the silence, then the voices of soldiers as they searched for survivors." Nate closed his eyes, the memories flooding back. The mission briefing intelligence had located a band of renegade warriors responsible for raids on settlements. The orders eliminate the threat. The reality, a village of mostly women, children, and elders. A handful of men, most unarmed. No warriors. No weapons cache. No evidence of raiding parties. A massacre. "I was ordered to check the creek bed," he said hoarsely. "That's where I found the children." Sophia nodded. 7 of us, hidden in various places along the stream. You spoke to us in our language, told us you wouldn't harm us. You led us away from the burning village, gave us food and blankets, and then—" She hesitated. "You argued with your superior officer, told him there were no warriors, only families, that the intelligence was wrong." "Major Caldwell," Nate spat the name like a curse. "He ordered me to execute the survivors. No witnesses, but you refused. I threatened to report him instead. Said I'd take my evidence all the way to Washington if necessary." Nate gave a bitter laugh. "I was young, idealistic. Thought the truth would matter." "It mattered to us," Sophia said quietly. "You saved our lives that day." Nate shook his head. "I couldn't save the others. 53 dead, most of them women and children. All to cover up a land grab." He drained his whiskey in one swallow. "The valley had a silver deposit. Caldwell and his commanding officer, Colonel Blackwood, had arranged to clear out the hostile Indians so mining interests could move in. They fabricated reports of raids, planted evidence, created a pretext for the attack. And when you threatened to expose them, they attempted to court-martial me for insubordination. When that failed, due to lack of witnesses, they tried to arrange an accident during a patrol." Nate gestured to an old scar that ran along his jawline. "I survived. Resigned my commission instead of pursuing the matter further. They had too much power, too many connections in Washington." Sophia studied him with new interest. "So you retreated to this wilderness to hide from them?" "To hide from myself," Nate corrected her. "From what I was part of, however unwillingly." He set down his empty cup. "But you still haven't explained how you connected me to Shadow Valley after all these years, or why you're here now." Sophia rose and moved to her pack, again this time withdrawing a small oilskin pouch. From it, she removed a faded photograph and handed it to Nate. In the yellowing image, a U.S. Army captain stood proudly beside a beautiful Comanche woman who held a young girl of about 10 in her arms. The officer's face was instantly recognizable to Nate, though he hadn't seen the man in nearly a decade. "William Turner," he breathed. "My former commander." "My father," Sophia replied. "The woman is my mother walks with grace, and that's me." Nate stared at the photograph pieces falling into place. Captain William Turner had been his commanding officer before Caldwell transferred abruptly just prior to the Shadow Valley operation. Turner had protested. The transfer argued that intelligence about hostile activity in the region was faulty. He'd been overruled and reassigned to a desk position in St. Louis. 2 months after Shadow Valley, Turner had disappeared, entirely listed as AWOL, and eventually discharged in absentia. "Turner married your mother?" Nate asked, still processing this revelation. "In a Comanche ceremony, yes. The Army wouldn't recognize it officially, of course. I spent summers with my mother's people and winters with my father at whatever fort he was stationed." Sophia reclaimed the photograph, her fingers tracing its edges gently. "After Shadow Valley, after my mother was killed, my father came for me. He'd learned what happened, knew who was responsible. We fled together, assumed new identities. He raised me in the East under the name Reyes, his mother's maiden name. And now? Now he's been captured by the same men who want me silenced. Blackwood's men." "Blackwood?" Nate's head snapped up. "Vernon Blackwood. The same? No longer a colonel, of course. He's Senator Blackwood now, with aspirations for governor of Wyoming Territory." Sophia's eyes hardened. "And he can't afford to have his past exposed, especially with statehood on the horizon." Nate leaned back, absorbing this information. Vernon Blackwood had indeed risen through the ranks of both military and political power in the years since Shadow Valley. A war hero turned statesman, his name was frequently mentioned in newspaper editorials as the future of Wyoming leadership. "What does your father have that threatens Blackwood?" Nate asked finally. "Evidence. Records of the real mineral surveys conducted before the massacre. Original orders that were later modified. Names of witnesses who've since disappeared." Sophia's voice dropped lower. "My father spent years gathering proof while building a new life for us. He was careful, patient. But 3 months ago, something changed. He sent me away with instructions and a warning that Blackwood had somehow discovered his true identity." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded paper, handing it to Nate. "This was the last message I received, smuggled out by a sympathetic guard at the territorial prison in Cheyenne, where they're holding him on fabricated charges." The note was brief, written in a shaky hand. "Sophia, they found the maps, but not the journal. Blackwood knows about Kay. Find Hargrove in Bighorn Country. He's our last chance. Trust him with everything. With love, always. Father, the journal." Nate looked up from the paper. "My father's record of everything he discovered about Shadow Valley. Names, dates, transactions. All in a cipher only he and I understand." Sophia's expression was grim. "It's what they're really looking for, and it's why I came to find you. You have this journal." "I do." She nodded toward her pack. "But it's not complete. There are missing pieces, information my father kept separate for security. And time is running out. The execution date on his false charges is set for spring thaw." Nate rubbed his face, feeling the weight of the past settling on his shoulders once more. What exactly do you want from me, Ms. Reyes? I need your help deciphering the final pieces of my father's evidence. There are references to military operations and personnel only someone with your background would understand. Sophia leaned forward, her dark eyes intense in the firelight. And I need your testimony. You were there. You saw what happened. Together we could expose Blackwood for what he really is. At the cost of our lives, Nate observed. Blackwood won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens his ambitions. We're already marked for death, Sophia countered. You, because you know the truth about Shadow Valley. Me, because I have proof of it. The only question is whether we die in silence or take Blackwood down with us. The cabin fell quiet, save for the crackling fire and the persistent howl of the blizzard. Nate felt the pull of old obligations warring with his desire to remain uninvolved. 8 years he'd hidden in these mountains, wrestling with ghosts that never seemed to fade. "Let me see the journal," he said finally. Sophia hesitated only briefly before retrieving a small leather-bound book from her pack. She handed it to Nate, watching closely as he opened it. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, a mixture of English, Spanish, and what appeared to be random characters. Dates, locations, names interspersed with symbols and numbers that made no immediate sense. "It's a simple substitution cipher based on a Comanche counting song," Sophia explained. "My father taught it to me as a child." Nate flipped through the pages, recognizing names of officers, politicians, and businessmen connected to the Wyoming Territory. The dates spanned nearly a decade, with the most recent entries from just months earlier. "Turner was thorough," he murmured. "He was determined to see justice done, no matter how long it took." Sophia's voice softened with pride. "My father believed the truth always finds its way to the surface like water through stone. Slowly, perhaps, but inevitably." Nate closed the journal, troubled by its implications and his own role in them. "I need time to think about this. We have nothing but time at present." Sophia gestured toward the window where snow continued to fall heavily. "The storm will keep us and Blackwood's hunters in place for days." She rose and began clearing away their cups and bowls, moving around the small cabin with the same quiet efficiency she'd displayed in tending his wound. Nate watched her, struck by the strange circumstances that had brought them together after so many years. "You should rest," she said, returning to check his bandages. "The wound is healing well, but you lost considerable blood. Your strength will return faster with sleep." Nate nodded, suddenly aware of the exhaustion that had crept over him. Between the blood loss, the fever, and the weight of Sophia's revelations, he felt drained beyond measure. "We'll continue this discussion tomorrow," he said, easing himself back onto the bedroll. "Of course." Sophia adjusted the blankets around him with surprising gentleness. "Sleep well, Sergeant Hargrove." "Not a sergeant anymore," he mumbled, already drifting toward sleep. "Just Nate?" Her soft reply followed him into darkness. "Then sleep well, Nate. The ghosts will wait until morning." The days of the blizzard blended together in a strange domestic routine. Nate's strength returned gradually, aided by Sophia's knowledge of herbal medicine and her surprisingly good cooking. They fell into an uneasy alliance, sharing the small space and limited resources while the storm raged around them. Sophia revealed more about her life, how her father had created new identities for them. Both settled in Boston, where she received an education few women of mixed heritage could access. How she'd trained as a nurse during the latter years of the Indian Wars, treating both soldiers and native peoples with equal care. How she'd eventually returned west, searching for her own answers about Shadow Valley. Nate in turn shared little of his life after the army. He'd wandered for a time, worked as a guide, a hunter, finally purchasing the isolated cabin and surrounding acres with his military savings. He preferred solitude, he said, fewer complications. On the third evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Sophia withdrew the small harmonica from her pocket and began playing a haunting melody that made Nate's skin prickle with recognition. "I know that song," he said when she finished. "I heard it in the village before." He trailed off, unwilling to complete the sentence. "Before the massacre," Sophia finished for him. "Yes, it's a healing song meant to bring peace to troubled spirits. My grandmother taught it to me the day before she died." Nate stared into the flames, remembering. "Shadow Valley. That was the place you mentioned growing up, Mumui Kuka Yoa Yopu." Sophia nodded, running her fingers along the harmonica. "It was my mother's ancestral home, the place where generations of her family had lived and died. All gone now." "I'm sorry," Nate said simply. "You have nothing to apologize for. You tried to prevent it. You saved those you could." Sophia tucked the harmonica away. "My father told me how you argued against the mission from the beginning, how Blackwood had you transferred to Caldwell's command to silence your objections." Nate frowned. How would Turner know that he was already reassigned when I was transferred? He had friends who kept him informed, and after Shadow Valley, he made it his mission to learn everything about the operation and those behind it. Sophia hesitated, then added, "That's how he learned about the silver mine that now operates where the village once stood, about the investors who funded it, including Blackwood's brother-in-law." "Follow the money," Nate murmured. "Always good advice." They sat in companionable silence for a time, listening to the wind's diminishing fury. The storm was beginning to abate, which meant decisions could no longer be postponed. "Why did you really come looking for me, Sophia?" Nate asked finally. "The truth, not just what your father's note said." Sophia studied him, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. "I told you. I need your help with the journal and your testimony about what happened." "There's more to it than that." Nate shifted, wincing slightly as his healing wound protested. Turner could have approached any number of officials with his evidence. Senators opposed to Blackwood's faction, newspaper editors, territorial judges. Why me, a recluse living in the wilderness with no connections, no influence? "Because you were there," Sophia insisted. "You saw—" "So did Turner." Nate interrupted. He knew what Blackwood and Caldwell were planning. He tried to stop it. His testimony would carry more weight than mine ever could. Sophia looked away. "Perhaps." "There's something you're not telling me," Nate pressed. "Something in that journal that you haven't shared." The silence stretched between them, taut with unspoken truths. Finally, Sophia sighed and reached for the leather-bound book. "There's a section my father encoded differently from the rest. A section I haven't been able to decipher despite knowing the primary key." She opened the journal to the back pages where the writing changed to a denser pattern of symbols. "The last entry I can read mentions a final witness whose testimony would destroy Blackwood completely. Someone who possesses physical evidence that even Blackwood's political allies couldn't ignore." "And your father thought I knew who this witness was?" Nate asked, skeptical. "No." Sophia met his gaze directly. "I believe he thought you were the witness." Before Nate could respond, a new sound cut through the night. Not the wind, which had finally died down, but the distant howl of a wolf. Except it wasn't quite right, too deliberate in its rising and falling notes. Nate was on his feet, instantly reaching for his rifle. "Douse the lamp," he ordered quietly. Sophia complied without question, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the glow of the banked fire. "What is it?" "Signal," Nate replied, moving carefully to the window. "Hunter to hunter. Someone's out there." He peered through a gap in the curtains, scanning the moonlit landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine world of white, broken only by the dark silhouettes of pine trees. Nothing moved in the immediate clearing around the cabin. "Could be trappers," Sophia suggested, though her tone belied the optimistic words. "This far into my property? Not likely." Nate checked that his rifle was loaded. "How many men did you say were hunting you?" "5 that I know of." Sophia had moved to retrieve her own weapon, a compact revolver that had been hidden in her boot. "Led by Gabriel Reed." Nate froze. "Reed? Gabriel Reed. You know him." "We served together. He was my closest friend in the regiment." Nate's voice had gone flat. "Before he betrayed our unit for Confederate gold during the war. Before he became a bounty hunter who tracks men for sport as much as money." The wolf call sounded again, closer this time. "Definitely human." "He's good," Nate continued, moving away from the window. "One of the best trackers I've ever known. If he's found us, despite the storm, he won't be coming alone." "What do we do?" Sophia asked, her calm demeanor intact, despite the danger. Nate considered their options. The cabin was defensible, but ultimately a trap if surrounded. The horses in the lean-to shelter behind the cabin provided escape, but fleeing into snow-covered terrain would leave an obvious trail, and his wound, while healing, would slow them down. "First, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with," he decided. "How many men, how they're positioned. Then we can plan." He turned to Sophia. "How good are you with that revolver?" She checked the cylinder with practiced ease. "Good enough. I'm a better shot with a rifle, though." "Take mine, then." Nate handed her his Winchester, keeping his Colt revolver for himself. "Stay here. Keep watch through the window, but stay back from the glass. If anyone approaches the front, shoot to kill." "Where are you going?" Alarm edged into her voice for the first time. "Around back. There's a crawl space under the north wall where I store extra supplies. I can slip out that way, circle behind whoever's out there." Nate was already gathering his coat and gloves. "If I'm not back in 20 minutes, assume the worst. Take a horse and ride east toward the Buffalo Creek settlement. There's a man there, Samuel White, who owns the general store. Tell him Nate sent you. He'll help." Sophia gripped his arm as he turned to leave. "This is reckless. You're still wounded. We need information more than safety right now." He gently removed her hand. "Besides, this is my territory. I know every tree and rock. Reed may be good, but this is my hunting ground." She searched his face in the dim light, then nodded once. "Be careful. I didn't save your life just to watch you throw it away." Nate allowed himself a grim smile. "I'm not planning on dying tonight. Too many unfinished matters." With that, he slipped through the cabin to the small storage pantry, moved aside a stack of crates, and revealed a trapdoor in the floor. Cold air rushed up as he lifted it, carrying the earthy scent of the crawl space below. 20 minutes, he reminded Sophia, who had followed with a lamp. Not a moment longer. She extinguished the lamp, leaving him to descend into darkness. "Godspeed, Nate." The space beneath the cabin was tight but navigable, designed specifically as an escape route by a man who understood the value of back doors. Nate crawled through the frozen dirt, ignoring the protest of his wounded shoulder, until he reached the small opening near the foundation's northern corner. It was disguised by a hinged section of siding that looked like part of the cabin's structure from the outside. Pushing it open carefully, Nate peered into the moonlit night. The snow had stopped completely, leaving behind a crystal-clear sky filled with stars that cast blue-white light across the landscape. Beautiful, but also dangerous visibility was excellent in both directions. He slipped out and closed the hidden door behind him immediately, pressing his back against the cabin wall. The cold bit through his clothing, a sharp reminder of the danger of prolonged exposure. He needed to move quickly, but stealth was essential. Nate surveyed his surroundings. The cabin sat in a small clearing with dense pine forest beginning about 50 yards away on all sides. The front faced south toward the crude road that connected eventually to the main trail. The lean-to shelter for his horses stood about 20 yards behind the cabin currently housing his gelding and presumably Sophia's mount as well. The wolf call had come from the west, where the terrain rose slightly before dropping away toward a creek that remained unfrozen even in winter due to its swift current. It would be the logical approach for anyone wanting to observe the cabin without being immediately visible. Moving in a low crouch, Nate made his way through the deep snow toward the tree line, using every shadow and depression for cover. His years as a scout served him well. Each step was placed deliberately, his weight distributed to minimize sound in the crusted snow. His breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the still air. He reached the forest edge and paused, listening. The night was silent in the way that only extreme cold can create a crystalline quality that seemed to amplify the slightest sound. Somewhere to his left, a branch cracked under the weight of accumulated snow. Not human movement. The timing was wrong. Nate worked his way through the trees, moving parallel to the western edge of the clearing. If Reed was using the ridgeline for observation, Nate needed to circle behind him, approaching from the creek side where he'd be least expected. The terrain became steeper, the snow deeper between the trees. Nate's boots sank to mid-calf, with each step making progress slow and exhausting. His wounded shoulder throbbed with renewed intensity, and he could feel fresh dampness spreading across the bandages beneath his coat. Too soon for this kind of exertion, he thought, grimly. But necessity rarely consulted with convenience. He paused to catch his breath, behind a large pine checking his bearings. The cabin was now invisible through the trees, but he knew it lay directly east of his position. The ridgeline rose to his right, while the land sloped downward to his left toward the creek. If Reed was setting up an ambush, he'd want high ground with clear lines of sight. Nate began moving uphill using the trees for cover. The revolver felt heavy in his hand, its metal cold even through his gloves. He thumbed back the hammer, wincing at the soft click that seemed thunderous in the silent forest. 20 yards further, the trees thinned as the ridge flattened into a small plateau. Nate dropped to a crouch, scanning the open area ahead. In the moonlight, he could make out tracks in the snow, at least 2 sets, maybe 3, all heading toward the edge of the ridge that overlooked his cabin. He followed the tracks, carefully stopping every few feet to listen. A faint glow ahead suggested a carefully shielded light source. Voices drifted on the still air, too low to discern words, but definitely human. Nate crept closer, using a fallen log for cover. Through a gap in the branches, he could now see 2 men huddled near the ridge's edge. A small, heavily shielded lantern sat between them, casting just enough light to illuminate a map spread across their knees. Both were heavily armed rifles, propped nearby pistols visible on their hips. "Should be back by now," one was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Reed knows what he's doing," the other replied. "Place is definitely occupied. Smoke from the chimney horses in the back. He's just making sure it's Hargrove before we move in. In this cold, could be anyone holed up there." Orders were clear. Verify, then eliminate. No mistakes this time. Nate's blood ran cold at the casual discussion of his murder. These weren't random bandits or opportunistic raiders. They were professional killers with a specific target: him. He weighed his options. 2 men here plus Reed somewhere else reconnoitering. Possibly more he hadn't spotted yet. Not good odds, especially in his weakened condition. As he considered his next move, a twig snapped directly behind him. "Hello, Nate," said a familiar voice, soft as a snake's hiss in the darkness. "Been a long time, old friend." Nate began to turn, but froze at the distinctive click of a hammer being cocked. "Now, no," the voice continued. "Let's not do anything hasty. Drop the revolver and stand up slowly. We have so much to talk about." Gabriel Reed stood 10 feet away, his tall frame silhouetted against the stars, a rifle aimed squarely at Nate's head. His face was hidden in shadow, but there was no mistaking the confident posture, the easy way he held the weapon. "I'd listen to him if I were you," came another voice as a fourth man stepped from behind a tree to Nate's right, also armed. Surrounded, outnumbered, and caught in the open. Nate carefully set his revolver in the snow and rose to his full height, hands raised slightly to show they were empty. "Reed," he acknowledged, keeping his voice steady. "Didn't expect a reunion in these parts." "Life is full of surprises." Reed stepped closer, his features now visible in the faint spill of moonlight. He was older than Nate remembered, deep lines carved around his mouth, and eyes, hair gone completely silver beneath his wide-brimmed hat. But his eyes were the same pale gray and cold as the winter sky. "Like finding you playing host to a wanted murderer." "Don't know what you're talking about," Nate replied evenly. Reed's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's not insult each other's intelligence, Nathaniel." "Sophia Reyes. Mixed-blood woman, about 5'6", carries a distinctive Comanche medicine bag. Sound familiar? She's been in your cabin for at least 3 days. Been watching that long, have you?" "Long enough." Reed gestured with his rifle. "Move, over to the camp, and don't try anything heroic. You were always predictable when it came to last stands." Nate had no choice but to comply, shuffling through the snow toward the 2 men by the ridge, who now stood with their own weapons drawn. 4 against 1. Impossible odds, especially unarmed. Sophia, he thought, with a pang of concern. At least she's warned and armed. The small camp came into view, just the lantern and map, a few packs leaned against trees. No horses visible. They'd left them somewhere else to avoid detection. "Sit," Reed ordered, indicating a fallen log. Nate lowered himself carefully, mindful of his throbbing shoulder. "What's this about Reed? Since when do you work as an assassin?" "Since it became extremely profitable." Reed handed his rifle to one of his men and squatted down across from Nate, just out of lunging range. "Senator Blackwood pays well for problems to disappear. And you, my friend, have become quite the problem." Blackwood. Nate felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. So Sophia was right. Reed's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, what exactly has Ms. Reyes been telling you? Enough to know Blackwood's worried about his past coming to light, about Shadow Valley." Something flickered across Reed's face. Surprise, perhaps, or concern. "That's ancient history. Not to the families of 53 dead Comanche, it isn't." Nate leaned forward slightly. "Not to Captain Turner, either." Reed went very still. "Turner is dead." "Is he interesting? You'd think so." Nate was gambling now, using the fragments of information Sophia had shared to probe for reactions. "Because from what I hear, Blackwood has him locked away somewhere very much alive." The men exchanged glances, a momentary uncertainty that told Nate his shot in the dark had struck close to truth. "You always were clever, Nate," Reed said finally. Too clever for your own good. It's why I argued against killing you 8 years ago after you left the army. I said you'd fade away, bury yourself in whiskey, and regret out here in the wilderness. He gestured at the surrounding forest. Seems I was right. Until now, Nate observed. Until now, Reed agreed. What changed, I wonder? Why, after all these years, would you suddenly become involved with Turner's daughter and their crusade against Blackwood? Maybe I got tired of running from the past. Reed laughed a harsh sound in the quiet night. The noble Nathaniel Hargrove, seeking redemption. Please. We both know what really happened at Shadow Valley. We both know your hands aren't clean. The words struck like a physical blow, but Nate kept his expression neutral. We all have blood on our hands from those days. Difference is, some of us regret it. Regret is a luxury for the weak, Reed replied. The strong look forward, seize opportunities. Blackwood understands that. It's why he'll be governor soon, and eventually more. Men of vision shape the future by leaving the past buried. Along with inconvenient witnesses, Reed shrugged. Progress demands sacrifice. And what's your cut for this particular sacrifice? 30 pieces of silver. A flash of anger crossed Reed's face. Always the righteous one, weren't you? Even back in the war, judging the rest of us for doing what was necessary to survive. He stood abruptly. Well, your moral superiority ends tonight. Blackwood wants this matter concluded before it can threaten his campaign. So you're going to kill me, and then Sophia. Nate kept his voice calm, though his mind raced for options. Pretty cold, even for you. Nothing personal, Nate. Just business. Reed drew his revolver. Though I admit there's a certain satisfaction in closing this particular chapter. You were always so certain you were better than the rest of us. Nate tensed, preparing for what might be his only opportunity. If Reed intended to execute him here now, there would be a moment, just a fraction of a second, where the killer's focus narrowed to the act itself. A moment of vulnerability. But Reed paused, head tilting slightly. Do you hear that? In the distance, a horse's whinny cut through the night, followed by the distinctive crack of a rifle shot. The cabin, one of the men said urgently. Reed cursed. Carter, stay with him. Phillips Jackson with me. The woman's making a break for it. 2 of the men immediately headed down the ridge, following Reed's long strides through the snow. The remaining guard, Carter kept his rifle trained on Nate, expression grim in the lantern light. Don't even think about it, he warned. Nate raised his hands slightly, the picture of compliance. Wouldn't dream of it. But his mind was already calculating distances, angles, the likelihood of Carter's reflexes in the cold. The man was young, probably inexperienced, despite his professional demeanor. His breath came in quick, visible puffs, betraying nervousness. Another shot echoed from the direction of the cabin, then a third. The guard's head turned instinctively toward the sound, attention divided for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Nate lunged forward, driving his shoulder into Carter's midsection before the man could bring his rifle to bear. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, the rifle discharging harmlessly into the air as they struggled in the snow. Carter was younger, stronger, uninjured, but Nate had desperation and experience on his side. He drove his knee into the man's groin, then slammed his elbow into Carter's throat when he gasped in pain. The guard's struggles weakened, and Nate managed to pin him, one hand clamped over his mouth to prevent any shout for help. Sorry about this, Nate muttered, and brought his fist down hard against the man's temple. Carter went limp. Nate quickly retrieved both his own revolver and Carter's rifle from the snow, checking that both were still functional, despite the brief submersion in powder. Satisfied, he bound and gagged the unconscious guard with strips torn from the man's own coat, dragging him behind the fallen log for minimal concealment. The gunfire from the cabin had stopped. Nate couldn't tell if that was good or bad news for Sophia. Moving as quickly as his injury allowed, he began making his way down the ridge toward the cabin using the trees for cover. Reed and his men would be approaching from the front, expecting Sophia to flee on horseback. But if she'd had the presence of mind to create that diversion, and Nate suspected she had, then she was likely still inside preparing for their assault. He needed to reach her before Reed realized the ruse. Needed to even the odds. The cold night air burned in his lungs as he pushed himself harder, ignoring the fresh blood now soaking through his bandages. His shoulders screamed with every jarring step through the deep snow, but he pressed on, driven by a growing sense of urgency. Sophia had come seeking his help, bearing the truth he'd spent 8 years hiding from. She'd saved his life, trusted him with her father's mission. He would not abandon her now. As Nate neared the edge of the clearing, he saw Reed and his 2 men spread out in an assault formation using the scattered woodpiles and outbuildings for cover as they approached the cabin. The front door stood partially open, a tactical error that made Nate instantly suspicious. A trap, he realized. Sophia was smarter than that. He changed course, circling to approach the cabin from the rear, where the lean-to shelter housed their horses. If he could reach the crawlspace entrance, he could get inside unseen and coordinate with Sophia. The horses were agitated, but still present. Another clue that Sophia hadn't fled. Nate crouched behind the lean-to, watching as Reed signaled his men to converge on the open door. Their confidence suggested they thought they had the upper hand. They don't know her, Nate thought, with grim satisfaction. They have no idea what they're walking into. He made his way to the hidden entrance, slid inside the crawlspace, and pulled the concealed door closed behind him. In the pitch darkness, he navigated by memory and touch until he reached the trap door leading up into the cabin's pantry. Pressing his ear against the rough wood, he listened for movement above. Nothing. Carefully, he pushed upward on the door. It didn't budge. Sophia had blocked it, smart but inconvenient for his return. Nate tapped lightly on the wood, a pattern of 313 that no random noise would replicate. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the weight above shifted, and the trapdoor opened a crack, revealing a sliver of Sophia's face, illuminated by faint light. "Nate," she whispered, relief evident in her voice. "Let me in," he urged. "Reed and 2 men are approaching the front." The obstruction of barrel, from the look of it, was moved aside, and Nate climbed up into the pantry. Sophia immediately replaced the barrel, then led him into the main room of the cabin. She had transformed the space into a defensive position. The table was overturned to create cover facing the front door. The lantern was extinguished, with only the banked fire providing minimal illumination, and the windows were blocked with blankets to prevent silhouettes from being visible from outside. "I heard shots," Nate said quietly, checking the load in his revolver. "I fired at the trees, then spooked the horses to make them think I was fleeing." Sophia held Nate's Winchester rifle with comfortable familiarity. "There's a man watching the back. I spotted him from the window before I covered it. That would be the 4th. I encountered them on the ridge, Reed and 3 others. I managed to neutralize one." Sophia's eyebrows rose. "Impressive, given your condition. And speaking of which," Nate grimaced, pressing a hand against his blood-soaked shirt, "I may have reopened the wound." "Let me see." Sophia set down the rifle and moved to examine his shoulder, her touch professional and light. "You've torn some stitches, but it's not as bad as it could be." We'll deal with it after. A voice from outside interrupted her. Nathaniel Hargrove. Reed called his tone conversational, as if inviting Nate for a drink, rather than preparing to kill him. I know you're in there. Your escape attempt was clever, but ultimately futile. My men are positioned to ensure neither you nor Ms. Reyes leaves this place alive. Nate moved to the overturned table, positioning himself where he could see the partially open door while remaining in cover. He's trying to draw us out, he whispered to Sophia. Make us panic. She nodded, taking position on the opposite side with the Winchester. What's our plan? We need to even the odds, Nate replied, thinking quickly. 3 outside, possibly 4 if the one I left tied up has been found and freed. They'll try to force us to divide our attention attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The crawl space, Sophia suggested. Could we use it to outflank them? Possibly, but it would mean splitting up. I don't like those. Reed's voice cut through the night again, closer this time. I'm going to make this simple, Nate. Surrender the woman and the journal, and you might walk away from this. Senator Blackwood's quarrel isn't with you, not really. It's Turner and his crusade that concern him. He's lying, Sophia said softly. Blackwood will never let either of us live, not with what we know. Nate nodded grimly. Reed knows it too. He's just following the playbook, offer false hope, then strike when defenses lower. A new voice called out deeper, and with a southern drawl. We found your lookout, Reed. Trussed up like a Christmas turkey. Hargrove's been busy. Reed's response was too low to hear clearly, but the tone suggested frustration and recalculation. Nate allowed himself a small smile. They'd found Carter, which meant Reed now knew Nate was armed and dangerous, not trapped and helpless, as he'd assumed. Front and back simultaneously, Nate murmured, anticipating their strategy. Standard military assault on a fixed position. As if confirming his prediction, a shot rang out, shattering one of the front windows despite the blanket covering it. Glass tinkled across the floor as cold air rushed in. A moment later, the back window suffered the same fate. Creating entry points. Sophia observed, remarkably calm for someone under fire. Reducing our defensive options. They'll rush us next, Nate agreed. On Reed's signal. He reached across the space between them, clasping her hand briefly. Whatever happens, know that I believe you. About Turner, about Shadow Valley, all of it. If we don't make it through this, I want you to know that. Sophia's fingers tightened around his. We will survive this, she said with fierce certainty. Too many have died for the truth to be buried now. Outside, Reed's voice rose in command. Now. The front door crashed fully open as a figure charged through, firing wildly into the cabin. Simultaneously, the back window frame splintered as another attacker attempted to force entry there. Nate and Sophia reacted instantly. Her rifle cracked once, twice, and the man at the front door crumpled mid-stride, his revolver discharging harmlessly into the floor as he fell. Nate spun toward the rear window where a second man was halfway through the broken frame. He fired twice, catching the intruder in the chest and shoulder. The man jerked backward, disappearing from view with a strangled cry. Reed! Sophia called urgently, scanning for the leader. A shot answered her, the bullet splintering the wood of the overturned table inches from Nate's head. Reed had positioned himself just outside the front door, using the wall for cover. Nathaniel Hargrove and Sophia Reyes, Reed's voice carried an official tone now. By the authority of the Wyoming Territorial Marshal's Office, you are ordered to surrender yourselves for the crimes of murder, espionage, and conspiracy against the United States government. Since when are you a lawman, Reed? Nate called back, repositioning himself away from where Reed had last fired. Last I checked, Bounty hunting wasn't a badge of office. Circumstances change, Reed replied. Surrender now, and I guarantee you'll receive a fair trial. Nate caught Sophia's eye across the room and gestured toward the pantry. She nodded in understanding. "What about Turner?" Nate asked loudly, keeping Reed distracted while Sophia slipped toward the crawlspace entrance. "Will he receive the same fair trial, or has Blackwood already arranged his convenient death in custody?" A pause then. "William Turner is a traitor who married an enemy of the state and betrayed his oath as an officer. His fate is sealed by his own actions." Sophia froze mid-step, her face hardening at Reed's words about her father. Nate shook his head fractionally, urging her to continue with the plan. Reluctantly, she complied, disappearing into the pantry. "Seems Blackwood's the one afraid of a fair trial," Nate called, shifting position again to maintain Reed's focus. "If what happened at Shadow Valley came to light, I suspect his political aspirations would suffer considerably." A bullet splintered the doorframe near Nate's new position, suggesting Reed was attempting to locate him by sound. "Shadow Valley was a military operation against hostile forces," Reed replied, his voice colder now. "The official record is clear. The official record is a lie, and we both know it." Nate moved again, working his way toward the broken front window while keeping cover. No warriors, no weapons cache, no evidence of raiding parties, just families, women and children. Collateral damage in a necessary campaign to secure the territory. Reed's tone had changed, becoming almost rehearsed, as if reciting lines prepared for just such a conversation. Regrettable, but unavoidable in the march of progress. Progress? Nate couldn't keep the disgust from his voice. "Is that what you call slaughtering innocents for silver rights? For political advancement? I call it the way of the world, Nate. The strong prosper, the weak perish. It's been that way since time began." Reed's voice had moved, suggesting he was repositioning as well. "Men like Blackwood understand this. They're building a nation, carving civilization from wilderness. That requires difficult decisions, sacrifices. Convenient when the sacrifices are always someone else's lives," Nate replied, now close enough to the window to risk a glance outside. He couldn't see Reed, but noted the two fallen men, one motionless just inside the doorway, the other crumpled in the snow beneath the rear window. Both appeared dead or severely wounded. That left Reed and potentially one other attacker unaccounted for. A soft thud from outside the cabin's rear wall suggested Sophia had successfully exited through the crawl space and was now moving into position to flank Reed. Nate needed to keep him talking, keep his attention focused forward. "You know what really happened, Reed?" he continued, raising his voice slightly to ensure he was heard. "You weren't there that day, but you've seen enough operations like it. You know the difference between engaging enemy combatants and massacring a peaceful settlement." "What I know," Reed replied, his voice now coming from near the front corner of the cabin, "is that men like us are just tools, Nate. We follow orders, execute missions. The larger strategy isn't our concern. That defense didn't work at Nuremberg for the Confederates, and it won't work for Blackwood or Caldwell either." Nate moved closer to the window, preparing for what might be his only chance at a clear shot. "There's a line between warfare and murder. Shadow Valley crossed it. And what about the men you killed in the war? The Confederate soldiers who were just following their orders? Where was your moral outrage then?" Reed's voice had taken on a taunting quality. "You've always been a hypocrite, Nate, judging others while ignoring your own sins." The words struck uncomfortably close to truths Nate had wrestled with for years. He pushed the doubt aside, focusing on the tactical situation. "Maybe you're right," he conceded, hoping to draw Reed into a false sense of security. Maybe I am a hypocrite, but that doesn't change what Blackwood did or what he's still doing to cover it up. Blackwood is securing his legacy, Reed countered, ensuring the sacrifices weren't in vain. The silver from that mine has helped build railways, town's infrastructure that benefits thousands. Would you undo all that progress to avenge a few dozen Indians who would have eventually been displaced anyway? Nate heard a soft crunch of snow outside Sophia moving into position. Reed, focused on their verbal sparring, hadn't noticed. "It's not about undoing progress," Nate said deliberately, softening his tone as if considering Reed's point. "It's about truth, about justice for those who had no voice." "Justice?" Reed laughed bitterly. "There's no justice in this world, Nate. Only power, and those wise enough to seize it. Blackwood understands this. It's why he'll succeed where idealists like you and Turner fail." Nate saw movement in his peripheral vision, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness beyond the clearing. Sophia approaching from Reed's blind side, Winchester raised. "Perhaps," Nate agreed, keeping Reed's attention. "But I'd rather fail fighting for what's right than succeed through murder and lies." "Noble sentiments from a man about to die," Reed replied. "Any last words before I finish what I came here to do?" "Just one question," Nate said, tensing for action. "Did you ever wonder why I insisted on building my cabin with a crawl space?" There was a momentary silence as Reed processed the implication, then the sound of sudden movement outside. A rifle shot cracked through the night, followed immediately by a strangled cry and the thud of a body hitting snow. Nate lunged for the window, revolver raised, but halted at the sight that greeted him. Reed lay sprawled in the snow, the Winchester's bullet having taken him high in the chest. Sophia stood over him, the rifle still aimed at his heart, her expression cold in the moonlight. "Finish it," Reed gasped, blood bubbling at his lips, as he stared up at her. "Like father, like daughter." "My father never murdered anyone," Sophia replied quietly. "Unlike Blackwood. Unlike you." Reed's laugh turned into a wet cough. "You don't know the whole story. Ask him." His eyes shifted toward the cabin. "Ask Hargrove what really happened at Shadow Valley." Sophia glanced toward the window where Nate stood, uncertainty flickering across her face. Reed, seeing his opening, suddenly reached for a small derringer hidden in his boot. The Winchester cracked once more, and Reed went limp, the hidden weapon falling unused from his lifeless fingers. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by the soft hiss of snowflakes beginning to fall once more from the clouded sky. The storm was returning, as if nature itself sought to blanket the night's violence. Nate climbed carefully through the broken window, mindful of the jagged glass, and approached Sophia. She stood motionless, staring down at Reed's body, the rifle now lowered to her side. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, not meeting his gaze. "What did he mean?" "About asking you what really happened." Nate sighed, feeling the weight of 8 years of silence pressing down upon him. "Let's get inside. It's starting to snow again, and we need to check for other survivors." A quick survey confirmed that all 4 of Reed's men were dead, 2 inside the cabin, 1 beneath the rear window, and the unfortunate Carter, who had been executed by his own companions after being found bound and helpless on the ridge. Reed had left no loose ends, no witnesses to his failed mission. By the time they returned to the cabin, the snow was falling steadily. They dragged Reed's body inside, away from the elements and potential scavengers, then worked together to secure the broken windows and door as best they could against the growing storm. Sophia rekindled the fire while Nate examined his reopened wound. The bleeding had slowed, but fresh bandages would be necessary. They worked in silence, both processing the night's events and the questions that hung between them. Finally, as they sat before the restored fire, Sophia spoke. What was Reed talking about? What don't I know about Shadow Valley? Nate stared into the flames, seeing another fire from long ago, the burning lodges, the screaming women, the children running in terror. He was trying to divide us, he said finally. Create doubt. It's what Reed always excelled at, finding weaknesses, exploiting them. That's not an answer. Sophia's voice was soft but insistent. What don't I know? Nate, what haven't you told me? The moment of truth had arrived. Nate had spent 8 years hiding from it, burying it beneath isolation and whiskey and regret. But Reed's dying words had dragged it into the open, where it could no longer be denied. I wasn't just a witness to Shadow Valley, he said finally, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. I was part of it. I helped plan the operation, provided the intelligence that Caldwell and Blackwood used to justify the attack. Sophia went very still. What are you saying? I'm saying that before I tried to stop it, before I saved those children, I helped make it possible. Nate forced himself to meet her gaze, to face the horror and betrayal dawning there. I was young, ambitious, eager to prove myself. When Caldwell approached me about gathering intelligence on hostile elements in the region, I saw it as an opportunity for advancement. You knew they were planning a massacre. Disbelief colored her voice. No, Nate shook his head vehemently. I thought it was a legitimate operation against actual hostiles. I reported what I found honestly, no evidence of war parties, no weapons stockpiles, just families living peacefully. But Caldwell and Blackwood, they altered my reports, fabricated evidence, created a fictional threat to justify the attack. And you discovered this when, the day before the operation, when I saw the final orders. Nate's hands clenched into fists at the memory. I confronted Caldwell, told him the intelligence was wrong. He informed me that the accuracy of the reports was irrelevant. The decision had been made. The valley would be cleared one way or another. And yet, you participated. Sophia's voice had gone flat, emotionless. You rode with them. I thought I could mitigate the damage, convince the other officers on the ground that there was no threat. Nate's shoulders slumped. I was naive. By the time we reached the valley, Caldwell had convinced the men they were facing deadly enemies. The shooting started before I could intervene. But you saved some of us, Sophia said softly, a question in her voice. When I saw what was happening, women, children being gunned down, something broke inside me. Nate closed his eyes, the images still vivid after all these years. I turned my weapon on one of our own men who was about to execute a group of children hiding by the creek. Ordered the rest of my squad to stand down. Some did. Others, you fought your own men to save us, Sophia finished for him. That's how you got that scar on your jaw. Nate nodded absently, touching the old wound. Caldwell himself gave me that when I refused to follow his direct order to eliminate all witnesses. I managed to get the children to safety before he had me arrested for insubordination. Silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of revelation. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moaning around the cabin's eaves like the ghosts of those long dead. Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning? Sophia asked finally. How could I? Nate met her gaze, his own haunted. I helped create the circumstances that led to your mother's death, to the destruction of your home. My initial reports, however honest, became the foundation for the lie that justified the massacre. I've spent 8 years trying to forget my role in it, trying to convince myself that saving those few children somehow balanced the scales." He gave a bitter laugh. "But there is no balance for such things, is there? Only guilt that never fades." Sophia rose abruptly and moved to the window, pushing aside the blanket to stare out at the swirling snow. Her back was rigid, shoulders tense with emotion she seemed determined to control. "My father never mentioned your involvement in the planning," she said after a long pause. "He wouldn't have known. I was just a sergeant assigned to Caldwell after Turner's transfer. My reports went through regular channels, were probably sanitized before reaching higher command." Nate remained seated, giving her space. "Turner suspected something was wrong with the intelligence, which is why he protested the operation. But he never knew I was the source." Sophia turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the firelight. "All these years, I've held an image of you as the lone hero who stood against evil, who saved us while others killed. The reality is more complex, isn't it? You were both participant and savior, villain and hero. I was a man who made a terrible mistake and tried to correct it too late," Nate replied quietly. "Nothing more, nothing less." Another silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken judgments and reconsiderations. Finally, Sophia returned to her seat by the fire. "Reed's dead," she said simply, "but he won't be the last. Blackwood will send others when Reed fails to report back. We need to decide our next move." The sudden shift to practicalities surprised Nate. "You're not. I mean, after what I've told you. What did you expect me to denounce you? Attempt to kill you in your sleep?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. "The world isn't divided into heroes and villains, Nate. My father taught me that. Good men can do terrible things, and terrible men can occasionally do good. What matters is the choice they make when confronted with their own failings." She reached for her father's journal, which lay on the small table beside her. "You chose to save those children, to stand against your own people, when you realized the truth. That counts for something." "Not enough," Nate said softly. "Perhaps not. But it's a beginning." Sophia opened the journal to the encoded section at the back. "Now about this final witness, my father mentioned the one whose testimony could destroy Blackwood completely. I've been thinking about what Reed said about asking you what really happened." She turned the book toward Nate, pointing to a particular sequence of symbols. "This repeats several times in the encoded section. I initially thought it might be a name, but now I wonder if it's something else. A document, perhaps. Something you might have possessed from your time in the operation." Nate stared at the symbols, a cold realization dawning. "I think—" Nate leaned forward, studying the cryptic symbols in Turner's journal with growing recognition. "These aren't references to a person," he said slowly. "They're map coordinates, specific locations in and around Shadow Valley." Sophia's eyes widened. "You're certain?" "Yes." Nate traced the pattern with his finger. "This sequence here, it's a military grid reference system we used during operations. Your father must have copied it from official documents." "But what's the significance? What's at these locations?" Nate sat back, his expression troubled. "Evidence, most likely. The real survey markers from before the massacre, proving the military knew exactly what was in that valley and who lived there." "That would contradict the official record," Sophia said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The government claimed they had no knowledge of a permanent settlement in the area." "Exactly. They insisted it was just a temporary camp of hostile forces." Nate's jaw tightened. But if Turner found the original survey markers and documented their positions, it would prove premeditation. Sophia completed the thought. Not a military engagement gone wrong, but a deliberately planned removal of civilians for economic gain. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the storm had intensified once more, burying the night's violence under fresh layers of pristine snow. "There's more," Nate said finally. "After I was arrested for refusing Caldwell's orders, I was held briefly at Fort Laramie awaiting court-martial. During that time, I wrote everything down: names, dates, overheard conversations, the altered intelligence reports. I included maps showing the actual layout of the village, the locations where civilians were killed." Sophia leaned forward intently. "What happened to this document? When it became clear they intended to make me disappear, rather than face a public court-martial, I entrusted it to a sympathetic lieutenant who promised to deliver it to authorities in Washington." Nate shook his head. "I never learned if he succeeded. After my accident and discharge, I made inquiries, but the trail went cold. The lieutenant had been transferred my document, presumably lost or destroyed. Or hidden," Sophia suggested, a new light in her eyes. "What if my father found it? What if that's what he's referring to in this encoded section?" Nate considered the possibility. "It would explain why he sent you to find me. Not just for my testimony, but because I would recognize the significance of these coordinates." He tapped the journal thoughtfully. "The question is, where would Turner hide something so dangerous? Somewhere Blackwood would never think to look." Sophia studied her father's cryptic handwriting. Somewhere connected to the evidence itself. A sudden realization made Nate sit up straighter. Shadow Valley. The actual locations marked in these coordinates. What better place to hide evidence of a massacre than at the scene itself? "But that's—" Sophia hesitated. "That's hundreds of miles from here in territory now controlled by mining interests. Blackwood's territory. Which makes it both the most dangerous and the most perfect hiding place." Nate closed the journal carefully. No one would expect Turner to return to the scene of his greatest tragedy, especially not with Blackwood's men hunting him. "You think my father buried the evidence at the actual site of the massacre?" Skepticism tinged Sophia's voice. "Not necessarily buried. Hidden in plain sight, perhaps. These coordinates are extremely specific." Nate moved to a trunk near his bed and pulled out a battered map case. "I have surveys of that region from my scouting days. Let's see exactly where these points lead." He spread a large topographical map across the floor, before the fire, its edges curling from age and use. The lines of valleys, ridges, and waterways formed a complex web across the yellowed paper, with handwritten notations scattered throughout. "Here," Nate said, placing his finger on a particular valley. "Shadow Valley, or Mumuikuka Yoahyopu, as your people called it." Sophia stared at the map, emotions playing across her face. It looked so small on paper, just a few inches of space that once held an entire world. "Maps can't capture what matters," Nate said softly. "The lives, the stories, the sacred spaces." He turned his attention back to the journal, methodically translating each set of symbols into coordinates and marking them on the map with small X's. 7 points in total, forming a rough circle around the valley's perimeter, with one central point in what had been the heart of the village. "That's strange," he murmured, studying the pattern. "These aren't just random locations. They form a very specific configuration." Sophia leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against his as she examined the marked points. "What do you mean? Military survey parties follow standard protocols, straight lines, grid patterns. These points—" Nate traced the circular arrangement with his finger. "They remind me of something, but I can't quite place it." Sophia studied the pattern silently for a moment, then reached into her pocket and withdrew the small harmonica. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the map. Puzzled, Nate nodded. She placed the harmonica directly on the central X, then aligned its length with the rising sun direction marked on the map's compass rose. The instrument's 7 holes aligned almost perfectly with the 7 perimeter points. "My mother's song," she said quietly. "The healing song I played for you." In the Comanche tradition, it's associated with 7 sacred directions: north, south, east, west, above, below, and center. The center represents the heart, the place where healing begins. Understanding dawned in Nate's eyes. Turner used a Comanche spiritual pattern to mark the locations, something Blackwood would never recognize, even if he found the coordinates. Something only someone versed in both worlds would understand. Sophia picked up the harmonica, turning it over in her hands. "My father gave me this before we parted. Said it had belonged to my mother, that it would guide me when I was lost." "He meant it literally," Nate said, amazed at Turner's foresight. "The harmonica isn't just a keepsake, it's a key to the hiding places." A newfound determination settled over Sophia's features. "Then we need to go to Shadow Valley." "It's not that simple," Nate cautioned. "That land is now privately owned by Blackwood's mining consortium, heavily guarded with restricted access. And that's assuming we could even make the journey. Its winter in high country passes will be snowed in until spring." "My father doesn't have until spring," Sophia replied, her voice hardening. "His execution is scheduled for the first thaw, 3 months at most." Nate ran a hand through his hair, considering their options. "Even if we could reach Shadow Valley, retrieving whatever Turner hid would be nearly impossible without being detected. And once Blackwood learns of Reed's failure, he'll double his efforts to find us. So we give up leave my father to die, and Blackwood to ascend to the governorship." Sophia's eyes flashed with barely contained anger. "Is that your solution?" "No," Nate replied evenly. "But rushing headlong into Blackwood's territory without a plan is suicide. We need to be smarter than that." The tension between them crackled like the fire, the revelation of Nate's past involvement in Shadow Valley still an unresolved current beneath their tentative alliance. Sophia was the first to break the strained silence. "You're right," she conceded. "A direct approach is too risky. But there must be a way to access the evidence without walking straight into Blackwood's hands." Nate considered the problem from different angles, his military training asserting itself. "We need more information about the current state of Shadow Valley, the security measures at the mine, and your father's exact location in Cheyenne." "I have contacts who might help with the latter," Sophia offered. "A nurse at the territorial prison who smuggled out my father's last message. She's sympathetic to our cause." "That's something," Nate acknowledged. "But we also need a way to move undetected. Once Reed is reported missing, Blackwood will have every road trail and settlement watched." He studied the map again, tracing potential routes with his finger. "And we need somewhere safe to regroup, somewhere Blackwood wouldn't think to look." Sophia followed his gaze across the map, her expression thoughtful. "What about this?" She pointed to a small notation near the eastern edge. "Buffalo Creek Settlement. Isn't that where you mentioned having a friend, Samuel White?" "Sam." Nate nodded slowly. "Yes, he might help. He owns the general store, has connections throughout the territory. More importantly, he hates Blackwood. Lost mining claims to him years ago through some legal chicanery. How far? 3 days hard ride in good weather. Longer in these conditions." Nate glanced toward the window where snow continued to fall. "But it's our best option. Reed and his men won't be missed for at least a few days. If we leave at first light, we might reach Buffalo Creek before Blackwood realizes what's happened. And from there, we reassess. Gather information, secure supplies, determine our next move." Nate rolled up the map decisively. "One step at a time, Ms. Reyes." "Sophia," she corrected him. "If we're to be partners in this venture, I think formalities are unnecessary." Nate met her gaze, struck by the quiet strength he found there. Despite all she had endured, the loss of her mother, the threat to her father, the discovery of Nate's own role in the tragedy that had shaped her life. "Partners, then," he agreed. "Though I'm still not convinced this isn't a fool's errand." "Most worthy causes appear foolish to the casual observer," Sophia replied, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. "My father used to say that." Turner always did have a philosophical streak. Nate rose, wincing slightly at the pull of his wounded shoulder. "We should rest while we can. Tomorrow will be challenging enough without the burden of exhaustion." Sophia nodded, but made no move toward the bed. Instead, she retrieved a small pouch from her pack and gestured toward Nate's shoulder. "Let me check your wound first. You've reopened it at least once tonight, and infection in these conditions could be fatal." Nate hesitated only briefly before sitting in the chair she indicated. There was something comforting about her clinical efficiency as she unwrapped the blood-stained bandages and examined the bullet wound. Her touch was cool and precise, professional rather than personal, yet Nate found himself acutely aware of her proximity. "The bleeding has stopped again," she observed, cleaning the area with a herbal solution that stung fiercely. "But you've torn several stitches. I need to replace them." "Do what you must," Nate replied, bracing himself for the additional pain. Sophia worked quickly, her needle flashing in the firelight as she closed the reopened wound with neat, even stitches. Throughout the procedure, she hummed softly the same Comanche healing song she had played on the harmonica. "My grandmother was a healer," she explained when she caught Nate watching her. She believed music helped the body accept the medicine, guided the spirit toward wholeness. "And do you believe that?" Nate asked, genuinely curious. Sophia considered the question as she began wrapping fresh bandages around his shoulder. "I believe in what works," she said finally. "I've seen traditional medicine succeed where Western doctors failed, and Western techniques save lives that traditional methods couldn't. The wise healer uses all tools available. A pragmatic approach, necessary when you exist between worlds." And she secured the bandage with a small knot, then stepped back to examine her work. "Too tight." Nate experimentally rotated his shoulder. "It's good. Thank you." Sophia nodded and began packing away her medical supplies. "You should take the bed," she said. "I'll keep watch for a while." "I've slept enough these past days," Nate objected. "You rest. I'll wake you before dawn to prepare for departure." Sophia looked as if she might argue, then relented with a small nod. "Very well, but wake me in 4 hours to take my turn. You need rest too if we're to travel tomorrow." Nate agreed, though he had no intention of disturbing her sleep. The events of the past hours, the firefight, the revelations, the planning had left him restless, his mind too active for sleep, despite his body's exhaustion. After Sophia had settled onto the bed, Nate added wood to the fire and positioned himself near the repaired window with his rifle across his knees. The snow had tapered off, leaving the world outside wrapped in hushed whiteness that gleamed under the emerging moon. He studied the woman sleeping across the room, her profile outlined by the fire's glow. Fate had a strange sense of humor, he reflected, bringing them together after all these years. The orphan of Shadow Valley and the soldier who had helped create her tragedy, now united against a common enemy. Nate wondered if redemption was truly possible, or if some sins left permanent stains on the soul. For 8 years, he had hidden from his past, buried it beneath solitude and wilderness. Now, confronted with Sophia's presence and Turner's mission, he could no longer avoid facing what he had been part of. Perhaps that's the real purpose here, he thought. Not just justice for Shadow Valley, but accountability for all of us who played a role in that dark chapter. The night deepened around him as Nate kept his silent vigil watching over Sophia, while his mind wrestled with ghosts he had avoided for far too long. Dawn came gray and subdued the sun, a pale suggestion behind heavy clouds. Nate, who had allowed himself only brief moments of sleep during the night, was already preparing for departure when Sophia woke. "You didn't wake me," she observed, rising quickly and folding the blankets with practiced efficiency. "No need," Nate replied, not meeting her accusatory gaze. "I wasn't tired." "A tactical error," Sophia said, but didn't press the issue further. Instead, she joined him in the preparations, gathering supplies and packing them with the deliberate care of someone accustomed to traveling light and fast. They worked together in practical silence, communicating only when necessary about provisions, routes, and equipment. The bodies of Reed and his men presented a grim challenge. Leaving them unburied seemed disrespectful, but a proper interment in the frozen ground was impossible given their time constraints. "We'll have to leave them," Nate decided finally. "The cold will preserve them until spring, and by then—" He left the sentence unfinished, both of them aware that by spring their own fates would likely be decided one way or another. Sophia nodded her agreement, though her expression suggested the solution troubled her. Despite everything, she retained a respect for proper rituals of death that transcended personal animosity. By mid-morning, they had loaded their supplies onto the horses and were ready to depart. Nate took a final look around the cabin that had been his sanctuary and prison for the past 8 years. He would likely never see it again, regardless of how their journey ended. "Second thoughts?" Sophia asked, observing his hesitation from astride her mount. "No," Nate replied honestly, "just acknowledging an ending." They rode away from the cabin without further ceremony, leaving behind the sight of violence and revelation that had altered the course of both their lives. Nate led them east through a narrow trail that wound between snow-laden pines, choosing a route that balanced speed with concealment. Their tracks would be visible to a skilled tracker like Reed, but with luck, no one would come looking until they had put significant distance between themselves and the scene of last night's confrontation. The day passed in steady travel, the horses laboring through snow that sometimes reached their knees in the deeper drifts. Nate and Sophia spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, while remaining vigilant for signs of pursuit or potential shelter as the short winter day began to wane. By late afternoon, they had reached a small hunter's lean-to that Nate remembered from previous expeditions. It wasn't much, just a simple shelter of logs and branches, but it would provide enough protection for a cold camp overnight. "No fire," Nate cautioned as they unsaddled the tired horses, too visible from a distance. Sophia nodded her understanding, unpacking their bedrolls and the cold provisions they had prepared. The temperature was dropping rapidly as darkness approached their breath, forming clouds in the deepening twilight. "We made good time," she observed, handing Nate a strip of dried venison and a piece of hardtack. "Better than I expected with the snow." "We were fortunate. The trail I chose is sometimes impassable in winter, but the recent storm packed the snow enough to support the horses." Nate chewed the tough meat slowly, conserving his energy. "Tomorrow will be more challenging. We'll be crossing exposed ridge lines, where the wind can create dangerous conditions." Sophia wrapped herself in her blanket, conserving body heat against the encroaching cold. "Tell me about this friend in Buffalo Creek. Can we truly trust him?" Nate considered the question seriously. "Sam White is as honorable as men come in these parts. We served together briefly during the war, then reconnected years later when I was first scouting this region. He settled in Buffalo Creek after losing his mining claims to Blackwood's legal manipulations, making him an enemy of our enemy," Sophia observed. More than that, Sam's wife was Cheyenne, died of smallpox at a reservation school where they wouldn't allow him to visit her because their marriage wasn't recognized by federal authorities. Nate's expression hardened at the memory. He understands the government's treatment of Native peoples better than most white men. "I'm sorry for his loss," Sophia said quietly. "Such stories are all too common, yet each remains a personal tragedy." They ate the remainder of their simple meal in silence, the wind beginning to moan through the trees surrounding their small shelter. Without a fire, darkness enclosed them, completely broken only by the faint silvery glow of starlight reflecting off the snow. "We should try to sleep," Nate suggested, arranging his bedroll to create some barrier against the frigid air seeping through the lean-to's walls. "Tomorrow's journey will require all our strength." Sophia nodded and settled into her own blankets nearby. Despite the cold and uncomfortable conditions, exhaustion soon claimed them both, their breaths synchronizing in the quiet rhythm of sleep. Sometime in the darkest hours of the night, Nate jerked awake, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle beside him. He lay motionless, straining to identify what had disturbed his rest. Beside him, Sophia slept on her face, peaceful in the faint starlight, filtering through gaps in the shelter's roof. A soft sound reached him, the distant howl of a wolf answered by others from various directions. Real wolves this time, not human signals. Nate relaxed slightly, but remained alert, listening to the wild chorus that echoed across the frozen landscape. The wolves were far enough away to pose no immediate threat, yet their presence reminded him of the harsh reality of their situation. They were fugitives, in a wilderness that forgave no mistakes, pursued by forces as relentless as nature itself. Blackwood's power extended throughout the territory, his influence touching every settlement, every official channel. And Winter, the most merciless hunter of all, surrounded them with lethal patience. Nate glanced at Sophia, struck by her resilience. In the short time he had known her, she had saved his life, fought off professional killers, and confronted the painful truth of his involvement in her family's tragedy. Yet here, she slept, determined to continue a journey that most would consider hopeless. Turner raised a remarkable daughter, he thought. Whatever happened in the days ahead, he would do everything in his power to help her find justice for her father and the victims of Shadow Valley, even if it cost him his life, perhaps, especially then. Some debts could only be paid in full measure. The wolves' song faded into the night as Nate kept watch, his mind turning over plans and contingencies until the first pale light of dawn began to seep into the eastern sky. The second day of travel brought new challenges. As Nate had predicted, they encountered severe conditions on the exposed ridgelines, with wind-driven snow reducing visibility and numbing any exposed skin within minutes. The horses struggled against the elements, requiring frequent breaks in the shelter of whatever trees they could find. By midday, Nate was beginning to consider seeking more substantial shelter to wait out the worst of the weather when Sophia, riding slightly ahead, suddenly raised her hand in warning. "Riders!" she called back, her voice nearly lost in the wind, coming up the valley to the south. Nate urged his horse forward to join her at the ridge's edge. Below, following the more established trail that paralleled their less direct route, 4 mounted figures made their way steadily eastward. "Military patrol?" Sophia asked, squinting against the blowing snow. Nate studied the distant riders with practiced eyes. "No, not organized enough for cavalry. Likely a private party, hunters or travelers. Or Blackwood's men," Sophia suggested grimly. Possibly, though it seems soon for him to have organized a response to Reed's disappearance. Nate considered the situation carefully. "Either way, we should avoid contact. Follow me." He led them north, away from the established trail, and deeper into the forested slopes, where the trees provided both concealment and some protection from the bitter wind. The detour would add hours to their journey, but the alternative potential discovery by hostiles was unacceptable. They rode in tense silence, stopping occasionally to listen for pursuit. The unknown riders remained on the main trail, eventually disappearing from sight as the terrain shifted. By late afternoon, Nate felt confident enough to turn east again, aiming for a small meadow where he knew a trapper's cabin offered more substantial shelter than the previous night's lean-to. The cabin was crude but sound, with a small stone fireplace and enough dry wood stacked inside to warm the single room. After tending to the horses in the attached shed, Nate and Sophia gratefully shed their snow-crusted outer garments and set about creating a fire. "Do you think it's safe?" Sophia asked, gesturing toward the growing flames. "The smoke should be dispersed by the wind," Nate finished for her. "And the cabin is situated in a depression that makes it difficult to spot from a distance. The risk is acceptable, given our need for warmth." For the first time in 2 days, they were able to prepare hot food and drink the simple luxuries of warmth and cooked meat, raising their spirits considerably. As they ate, Sophia retrieved Turner's journal and spread it before them. "I've been thinking about these coordinates," she said, pointing to the pattern they had identified at Nate's cabin. "If my father hid evidence at these locations, how would he have marked them? The mining company would have altered the landscape, considerably removed anything obviously out of place." Nate considered the question. Turner was methodical. He would have used markers that appeared natural or insignificant to casual observation, but would be recognizable to someone who knew what to look for. He studied the map again. These points follow the Comanche sacred pattern, but they also align with natural features, rock formations, distinctive trees, the bend in the creek. Features that might have survived the mining operation. Some certainly. Mining tends to focus on specific areas rather than clear-cutting entire valleys. Nate traced the perimeter points on the map. These outlying locations might be relatively untouched, especially if they held no obvious mineral value. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "So if we can reach even a few of these points, we might recover enough evidence to make our case." "Possibly, but getting to Shadow Valley remains our greatest challenge. Blackwood's security would be suspicious of any strangers showing interest in the area, let alone 2 people matching our descriptions." Nate leaned back, staring into the fire. "We need more than just physical access. We need a plausible reason to be there that won't immediately trigger alarms." "What about approaching from a different angle?" Sophia suggested. "Not as ourselves, but in disguise, with different identities." "Possible, though risky. These aren't large settlements where strangers go unnoticed. Everyone is known, connections established." Nate frowned in concentration. "We would need more than just disguises. We'd need a story that explains our presence and grants us legitimate access." They fell into contemplative silence, the fire crackling between them as outside darkness claimed the winter landscape once more. The simple shelter felt almost luxurious after the previous night's exposure, creating a false sense of security that Nate knew better than to trust. "My father had an associate," Sophia said suddenly, "a geologist named Edward Holloway, who conducted the original mineral surveys of Shadow Valley before the massacre. He testified at the inquiry that there had been no indication of significant silver deposits in his initial assessment." Nate's straightened interest piqued. "I remember that name from the proceedings. His testimony was dismissed when later surveys conducted after the massacre discovered the silver vein that supposedly justified the whole operation." "Exactly. Holloway maintained that the second survey was falsified, that Blackwood had arranged for evidence of silver to be planted to justify the military action." Sophia's eyes gleamed with renewed purpose. My father stayed in contact with him over the years. Holloway now works for the Geological Survey in Denver. You think he might help us? I think he might provide the legitimate cover we need. Sophia leaned forward eagerly. A geological expedition to reassess mineral resources in the region wouldn't raise immediate suspicions, especially if properly documented and seemingly authorized. Nate considered the idea with growing appreciation. It has merit. Holloway could provide the necessary credentials and equipment to make such a cover convincing. But Denver is in the opposite direction from our current route, and considerably farther. Not necessarily. Sophia flipped through the journal until she found a particular page. According to my father's notes, Holloway frequently travels throughout the territory, conducting field assessments. His last known location was actually not far from Buffalo Creek, investigating potential coal deposits. Nate shook his head in amazement. That's almost too convenient. My father was thorough in maintaining his network of allies, Sophia replied with a small smile of pride. He believed preparation was essential to eventual justice. Turner always was 10 steps ahead of everyone else, Nate acknowledged. If Holloway is indeed near Buffalo Creek, that strengthens our original plan. We make contact with Sam White first, then use his local knowledge to locate Holloway and assess his willingness to help. The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, as if in agreement with their developing strategy. Outside, the wind had calmed somewhat, though the temperature continued to drop with nightfall. We should reach Buffalo Creek by late tomorrow if the weather holds, Nate calculated. But we'll need to be extremely cautious approaching the settlement. If Blackwood has indeed connected Reed's disappearance to us, by then he may have men watching all the nearby communities. We'll need a way to contact your friend discreetly, Sophia agreed, without exposing ourselves to potential observers. Nate nodded, already considering options. There's a widow who lives on the outskirts of the settlement, Martha Jenkins. Her late husband was friends with Sam. She sometimes carries messages for him when strangers might be noticed entering town directly. And you trust her. She has no love for Blackwood. Her husband's death was linked to unsafe conditions at one of his mining operations. Nate's expression hardened. Blackwood has left a long trail of grievances throughout the territory. Not all of his enemies are as visible as we are. Sophia studied him across the firelight, her dark eyes thoughtful. You've maintained more connections than you initially suggested for someone supposedly hiding from the world. Nate gave a small, rueful smile. Old habits. A scout learns to identify potential allies and resources even when not actively in the field. I may have withdrawn from society, but I never abandoned awareness of my surroundings. A fortunate tendency under the circumstances, Sophia observed, then changed the subject. You should rest. I'll take first watch tonight. I'm fine, Nate began to object, but Sophia raised a hand to silence him. You barely slept last night, and your wound needs proper rest to heal. Don't argue, Sergeant Hargrove. You know I'm right. The authoritative tone, reminiscent of the field nurses he had known during the war, brought an unexpected smile to Nate's face. Yes, ma'am, he conceded with a mock salute. Wake me in 4 hours. 6, Sophia countered. I slept well last night, and am not nursing a gunshot wound. Nate wanted to argue further, but found himself suddenly aware of the bone-deep fatigue that had been building since their departure. His wounded shoulder ached persistently, and the warmth of the fire was making it increasingly difficult to maintain alertness. 6 hours, he agreed reluctantly, but wake me immediately if anything seems amiss. Of course, Sophia promised, checking the load in her revolver with practiced ease. Now sleep. We have another long day ahead tomorrow. Nate arranged his bedroll near the fire and stretched out his body, gratefully sinking into the first relatively comfortable rest since leaving his cabin. Despite his intention to remain partially alert, exhaustion claimed him quickly, pulling him into a deep, dreamless sleep. When Sophia woke him, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the small window revealed the first pale hints of approaching dawn. 6 hours, he asked accusingly, noting the position of stars visible through the glass. Nearly 8, Sophia admitted without apology. You needed it, and there's been no sign of pursuit or other travelers. Rather than argue, Nate rose and stretched, carefully, pleased to find his shoulder less painful than the previous evening. Sophia had clearly changed his bandages while he slept. A fresh dressing was visible beneath his shirt, neat and professional. Thank you, he said simply, gesturing toward the wound. It's healing well, Sophia replied matter-of-factly. Another week without infection or reopening, and you should regain full mobility. They prepared for departure efficiently, consuming a light breakfast of coffee and hardtack, while the eastern sky gradually brightened. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a crystalline morning of intense blue skies and sparkling snow. Under different circumstances, Nate might have appreciated the pristine beauty that surrounded them. If we push hard, we can reach Buffalo Creek before sunset, he said as they saddled the horses. But we'll need to be cautious during the final approach. The settlement is in open country with limited cover. Sophia nodded her understanding, securing Turner's journal in her saddlebags with particular care. The leather-bound book had become almost a talisman for their journey, a physical link to her father and the mission that had brought them together. They rode out as the sun crested the eastern mountains, its light transforming the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling white expanse that almost hurt the eyes to behold. The cold remained intense but no longer life-threatening, allowing them to make better time than the previous day's difficult travel. By midday, they had descended from the higher elevations into rolling hill country, where stands of pine and aspen broke the monotony of the snow-covered terrain. Signs of human habitation began to appear. The occasional fence line, an abandoned homesteader's cabin, a distant column of smoke rising from what might be a ranch house chimney. We're entering more populated areas, Nate warned as they paused to rest the horses beside a half-frozen stream. From here on, we need to assume we might be observed at any time. Sophia pulled her hat lower and adjusted her scarf to better conceal her features. With her hair tucked beneath the hat and wearing Nate's spare coat, she could pass for a young man at a distance, a deliberate deception they had agreed upon that morning. How much farther to the Jenkins woman's place? She asked, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. About 3 hours following the creek downstream, Nate replied, surveying their surroundings with the habitual wariness of a scout. Her property sits just beyond that far ridgeline, separated from Buffalo Creek proper by about a mile of open meadow. They continued their journey with increased vigilance, avoiding the more established trails where possible, and keeping to the shelter of trees and terrain features. The landscape had opened considerably compared to the mountains, making concealment more challenging. Twice they detoured to avoid distant riders, adding time to their journey, but reducing the risk of chance encounters. Late afternoon found them approaching the ridge Nate had indicated, the winter sun already sliding toward the western horizon. They dismounted and led the horses up the gentle slope, keeping below the skyline to avoid being silhouetted against the bright sky. From the ridge's protected side, Nate surveyed the land ahead through a gap in the trees. Below a small homestead sat nestled against the base of the ridge, a modest cabin with attached barn, a fenced garden now dormant under snow, and a thin spiral of smoke rising from the stone chimney. Martha Jenkins, he confirmed, satisfaction evident in his voice, and beyond about a mile, as I said, Buffalo Creek settlement. Sophia joined him at the vantage point, studying the quiet homestead and the scattered buildings of the settlement visible in the distance. It seems peaceful enough. No obvious signs of unusual activity or watchers. Never assume, Nate cautioned. Blackwood's men would be careful not to draw attention. We'll approach Martha's place from the ridge side using the trees for cover until the last possible moment. They worked their way carefully down the slope, leading the horses through the deepening shadows of late afternoon. The sun had disappeared behind the western mountains by the time they reached the edge of the tree line, leaving the sky painted in fading shades of pink and purple above the darkening landscape. "Wait here with the horses," Nate instructed, handing his reins to Sophia. "I'll approach alone first. If anything seems wrong, I'll signal by adjusting my hat, and you should retreat immediately back into the hills." Sophia looked as if she might object, then nodded reluctantly. "Be careful. Even old friends can become enemies under the right pressure." "Martha Jenkins isn't the type to bend," Nate assured her, though he appreciated Sophia's caution. "Her hatred for Blackwood runs bone deep." He moved cautiously through the gathering dusk toward the cabin, staying close to the line of leafless fruit trees that marked the edge of the widow's small orchard. No dogs barked at his approach, a positive sign, as Martha kept 2 hounds that would have alerted her to strangers with less friendly intent. As Nate neared the back door, it opened suddenly, spilling warm lamplight into the blue twilight. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, the unmistakable shape of a shotgun held ready in her hands. "That's far enough," she called, her voice strong, despite her advancing years. "State your business or prepare to meet your maker." Nate halted obediently, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "Evening, Martha? It's Nathaniel Hargrove. Been a few years." The shotgun lowered slightly. "Nate, what in heaven's name brings you down from your mountain? And at such an hour, need your help, Martha, and your discretion." Nate remained where he stood, respecting the old woman's caution. "I have a companion with me. We're hoping you might get a message to Sam White without drawing attention." Martha was silent for a long moment, then lowered the shotgun completely. "You'd better come inside, both of you. There's been talk in town these past days. Strange men asking questions about outsiders seen in the region." Nate felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter evening. "Blackwood's men didn't claim to be, but had that look about them. The kind that carries trouble wherever they go." Martha stepped back, gesturing him forward. "Bring your friend. It's not safe to linger in the open." Nate signaled to Sophia, who emerged from the tree line leading both horses. Together, they approached the cabin, Martha watching with evident surprise as she realized Nate's companion was a woman. "Well, well," the widow murmured. "No wonder you're moving careful-like. Stable your horses in the barn first, then come in through the kitchen. I'll put coffee on." The small barn was neat and warm, with empty stalls ready for their mounts and ample hay for feed. Once the horses were settled, Nate and Sophia made their way to the kitchen entrance, where Martha waited with the promised coffee already steaming on the table. Martha Jenkins was in her 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She wore the practical clothing of a woman who managed a small homestead alone, sturdy skirt, woolen shawl, and worn but well-maintained boots. The shotgun had been set aside but remained within easy reach against the wall. "Sit," she instructed, indicating the chairs at her scrubbed wooden table. "Warm yourselves while I fetch some stew from the hearth. You both look half-starved and frozen besides." They obeyed gratefully, the kitchen's warmth seeping into their cold, stiffened limbs as Martha served generous portions of venison stew and thick slices of fresh bread. Only when they had eaten did she settle across from them, her shrewd gaze moving between their faces. "Now," she said without preamble, "what kind of trouble has you seeking out old Martha Jenkins After all these years, Nate Hargrove, and who's your lady friend who dresses like a man and carries a revolver in her boot?" Nate glanced at Sophia, who had removed her hat to reveal her long dark hair. "This is Sophia Reyes. She's the daughter of an old Army colleague who's in serious trouble. We need to reach Sam without being noticed by Blackwood's watchers." Martha's eyebrows rose at the mention of Blackwood. "Vernon Blackwood, the senator. What's he got to do with your troubles?" "Everything." Sophia spoke for the first time, her voice steady, despite the fatigue of their journey. "He's holding my father on false charges, and he's sent men to silence us both before we can expose crimes he committed years ago." Interest sharpened Martha's gaze. "What sort of crimes?" Nate hesitated, unwilling to involve the widow more deeply than necessary for her own safety. The kind that would end his political career and likely send him to prison. Serious enough that he's willing to kill to keep them hidden. Martha studied them both for a long moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "Sam's not in town at present. Rode out 2 days ago to deliver supplies to some surveyors camped near the old Harrison property. Expected back tomorrow or the day after." "Surveyors?" Sophia leaned forward intently. "Do you know who they are or what they're surveying?" "Some government men, I believe. Geological survey or some such," Martha replied. "Looking for coal deposits, according to Sam. Why is that important?" Sophia and Nate exchanged significant glances. "It might be," Nate said carefully. "One of them wouldn't happen to be named Edward Holloway." Martha's surprise was evident. "As a matter of fact, yes. Sam mentioned that name, specifically said he was an old-timer who'd been working these territories for decades." Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. "How did you know that?" "He's someone we need to speak with," Sophia explained. "A potential ally in our situation." Martha's expression suggested she knew they weren't sharing everything, but she didn't press further. "Well, you're welcome to wait here for Sam's return. My place is isolated enough that your presence shouldn't draw attention if you're careful." "We appreciate that," Nate said sincerely. "But we don't want to put you at risk. If Blackwood's men are asking questions in town, they might eventually expand their search to outlying properties." "Let them come," Martha replied with grim satisfaction, patting the shotgun beside her. "I've been waiting years for an excuse to express my feelings about Vernon Blackwood to his face, or at least to the faces of his hired thugs." Despite the seriousness of their situation, Nate found himself smiling at the widow's fierce determination. Martha Jenkins had lost her husband, her only son, and nearly her property to Blackwood's machinations over the years. Her hatred for the man was a smoldering ember that had never died. "Nevertheless," Sophia interjected gently, "we would prefer not to bring violence to your doorstep. Perhaps you could direct us to the surveyor's camp. We could intercept Sam there, away from town, and speak with Holloway simultaneously." Martha considered the request, then nodded reluctantly. "The Harrison property lies about 10 miles northeast of here. Abandoned homestead with a distinctive rock formation behind it. Looks like a sleeping bear if you see it from the right angle. Sam said the survey team had set up near the creek that runs along the eastern edge of the property." "I know the place," Nate confirmed. "We could reach it by midday tomorrow if we start at first light." "At least stay the night," Martha insisted. "Get a proper rest and a hot breakfast before you set out again. I have a spare room upstairs, and Nate can take the sofa near the fire. No one will see your horses in the barn, and I receive few enough visitors that your presence won't be remarked upon." The offer was too tempting to refuse, especially given their exhaustion and the comfort Martha's home offered compared to another night of cold camping. After some discussion, they agreed to accept her hospitality for the night, with plans to depart before dawn. As Martha showed Sophia to the spare room upstairs, Nate took the opportunity to check the surroundings once more, stepping onto the small porch that faced the distant town of Buffalo Creek. The settlement was now just a scatter of lights in the darkness, seemingly peaceful. Yet somewhere out there, Blackwood's men were searching for them, drawing the net tighter with each passing day. Their journey had brought them closer to potential allies, but also deeper into territory where Blackwood's influence was strongest. The next steps would be increasingly dangerous, contacting Holloway, formulating a plan to access Shadow Valley, and somehow gathering the evidence needed to free Turner and expose Blackwood's crimes. And beneath it all lay the constant awareness that time was running out. Turner's execution date approached with the spring thaw now just months away. Every day of delay reduced their chances of success. Nate's hand moved unconsciously to his wounded shoulder, which throbbed in rhythm with his troubled thoughts. The physical pain seemed appropriate somehow, a reminder of the violence that had brought them to this point, and the greater violence that likely lay ahead. Behind him, the cabin door opened, spilling warm light across the porch. Martha stepped out to join him, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the night's chill. "Your young lady seems to be carrying a heavy burden," she observed quietly. "More than just concern for her father, I'd wager." "She's seen more than her share of tragedy," Nate replied carefully. "And she's not my young lady. We're just allies in a common cause." Martha made a skeptical sound. "If you say so." She studied the distant lights of Buffalo Creek for a moment before continuing. "You should know that those men asking questions in town, they had a detailed description of you, right down to that scar along your jaw." Nate's stomach tightened. "How recent?" "2 days ago. Came through asking if anyone had seen a man matching your description, possibly traveling with a woman of mixed blood." Martha's voice hardened, "Offering good money for information. Did anyone take them up on it?" "Not that I heard. Buffalo Creek folks generally keep to themselves, especially when outsiders come nosing around." Martha glanced sideways at him. "But money has a way of loosening tongues given time, and Blackwood has plenty to spread around." "All the more reason for us to move on quickly," Nate concluded grimly. "I appreciate the warning, Martha. And everything else." The widow nodded, pulling her shawl tighter as a cold breeze swirled across the porch. "Whatever Blackwood did that has you and that girl running for your lives, I hope you make him pay for it. That man has brought nothing but misery to these parts, for all his fine words about progress and prosperity." "We intend to," Nate promised softly, "one way or another." They stood in silence for a time, watching the night deepen around them, each lost in private thoughts of justice long denied and debts yet to be paid. As if reading his mind, Martha spoke once more before turning to go back inside. "Just remember, Nate, vengeance and justice ain't always the same thing. Make sure you know which one you're really after before this is done." The door closed behind her, leaving Nate alone with the night and the weight of her words. He remained on the porch a while longer, considering the path that had led him here and the uncertain road that lay ahead. Vengeance or justice, he wondered. Perhaps, in the case of Shadow Valley, they were one and the same. The scales balanced only when those responsible faced the consequences of their actions, all of them himself included. With that sobering thought, Nate finally returned inside to claim what rest he could before the journey resumed. The night passed without incident, though Nate slept lightly, waking at every creak of the old cabin's timbers. By the time the eastern sky showed the first faint lightening of approaching dawn, he and Sophia were already preparing for departure, accepting a hearty breakfast and additional supplies from their generous hostess. Sam knows to be cautious these days, Martha told them as they saddled the horses in the pre-dawn darkness. When you find him, tell him Martha says the birds are nesting early this year. He'll understand you're to be trusted. Thank you for everything, Sophia said warmly, clasping the older woman's hand. I won't forget your kindness. Just see justice done, Martha replied firmly. That's all the thanks I need. They rode out as the stars were fading, heading northeast across country that Martha assured them would be sparsely populated. The Harrison property lay in a region considered poor for farming and ranching, making it ideal for their purposes, minimal chance of encounters with locals who might later report their presence. As the sun rose, fully painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink, Nate allowed himself a cautious optimism. They had evaded immediate pursuit, found temporary shelter, and were now heading toward not one, but two potential allies. Perhaps Turner's meticulous planning would prove successful after all. Beside him, Sophia rode with renewed determination, her face set in lines of quiet resolve. Whatever doubts she might harbor about Nate's past involvement in Shadow Valley, she had set them aside in service to their shared mission. Her focus remained fixed on the goal, freeing her father and exposing Blackwood's crimes. What do you think Holloway will be able to tell us? Nate asked, as they paused briefly to rest the horses beside a frozen stream. If my father's notes are correct, he was one of the few who saw the original survey data before it was altered, Sophia replied. He may be able to provide details about exactly what was changed and by whom, creating a chain of evidence leading directly to Blackwood. And you believe he'll help us? After all these years, Sophia's expression grew thoughtful. My father trusted him. That's enough for me to at least approach him. Whether he's willing to risk Blackwood's wrath again after all this time, that remains to be seen. They continued on the terrain, gradually changing from open meadows to more broken country, punctuated by low hills and shallow ravines. By mid-morning, Nate recognized landmarks that indicated they were approaching the Harrison property, an abandoned homestead that had passed through several owners before being finally forsaken after repeated crop failures. There, he said, pointing toward a distinctive rock formation visible on a distant ridge. The sleeping bear Martha mentioned. The Harrison place should be just beyond that next rise. As they crested the hill, the abandoned homestead came into view, a weathered cabin with partially collapsed roof, a listing barn, and the remains of fences now mostly reclaimed by nature. Beyond, along the creek, Martha had described several tents, and a small camp were visible with horses picketed nearby and smoke rising from a cooking fire. The survey team, Sophia confirmed, relief evident in her voice. And is that? A familiar figure was just emerging from one of the tents, a stocky man with a full beard dressed in the practical clothing of a frontier shopkeeper rather than the more formal attire of government surveyors. Even at this distance, Nate recognized his old friend Sam White. Perfect timing, Nate said with satisfaction. Now let's hope these surveyors are as potential helpful as we think, and that Blackwood's influence hasn't reached this far yet. They urged their horses forward, approaching the camp openly rather than attempting concealment. With several men visible around the fire, stealth would have been pointless, and an overly cautious approach might trigger unnecessary alarm. Sam spotted them first, his hand dropping instinctively to the revolver at his hip before recognition dawned on his weathered face. He stepped forward to meet them as they reined in at the edge of the camp. Nate Hargrove, he called, his voice a mixture of surprise and wariness. Wasn't expecting to find you this far from your mountain retreat. Especially not these days, with certain parties asking after you in town. Hello, Sam, Nate replied, dismounting carefully to shake his old friend's hand. Martha said we might find you here. She also said to tell you the birds are nesting early this year. Sam's expression cleared at the code phrase, though his eyes remained watchful. "I see. And who's your companion?" "Sophia Reyes," Nate introduced her as she dismounted, "daughter of William Turner. We've come to speak with both you and Edward Holloway, if he's among your survey team." At the mention of Turner's name, Sam's eyebrows rose dramatically. He glanced toward the other men gathered around the fire who were watching the exchange with undisguised curiosity. "You'd better come join us," he said finally. "As it happens, Edward Holloway is indeed here, and I suspect the two of you have quite a story to tell." Nate nodded, leading their horses forward into what he hoped would prove a sanctuary rather than another danger on their increasingly perilous journey. Beside him, Sophia walked with head held high, Turner's journal secure in the inner pocket of her coat, the evidence that might yet bring justice to the ghosts of Shadow Valley. Whether that justice would come at the cost of their own lives remained to be seen. But for now they had found the allies they sought, and with them a renewed hope that Turner's long-laid plans might yet bear fruit. The first piece of their desperate gambit was in place. The next would be far more dangerous, returning to the Valley of Shadows, where everything had begun and where Blackwood's power was strongest. Edward Holloway was not what Nate had expected. The geologist was a small, wiry man in his 60s, with bright, inquisitive eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and an energy that belied his age. He'd welcomed them to the survey camp with cautious interest, especially after Sophia had revealed her connection to William Turner. Now they sat around the fire as evening settled over the landscape, the day having been spent in intense discussion and planning. Sam White and two trusted members of the survey team joined them, all sworn to secrecy about the visitors and their mission. "These coordinates," Holloway mused, studying the patterns they'd identified in Turner's journal, "are ingenious. Not only do they follow the Comanche spiritual configuration, but they also correspond to the precise locations where I conducted my original survey before the massacre." "Locations Blackwood would have known about," Nate observed. "Precisely." Holloway nodded vigorously. "Which makes them perfect hiding places for evidence. Blackwood would never suspect Turner would use the very sites that had been compromised as repositories for damning proof." Sophia leaned forward, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. "Can you help us reach them?" "The mining operation must have changed the landscape considerably since then." "More than you might think, yet less than you might fear." Holloway reached for a leather portfolio and extracted several maps, spreading them on a flat rock near the fire. "The primary mining activity has focused on the southern portion of the valley where the richest silver deposits were found. The northern section, including several of these coordinate points, remains relatively undisturbed." "What about security?" Nate asked the tactician in him, assessing their greatest challenges. Sam answered, his expression grim. "Blackwood maintains a private force of about 20 men at the mine site, former military, mostly well-armed, and not overly concerned with legal niceties. They patrol regularly, especially the main access routes. Which is why a geological survey team provides the perfect cover." Holloway interjected, excitement evident in his voice. "I've conducted assessments at various Blackwood properties over the years. While not exactly welcomed, my official capacity has always granted me access with minimal interference." "You're suggesting we accompany you in an official capacity," Sophia concluded. "As my assistants, yes." Holloway's eyes gleamed with determination. "I've been waiting 15 years for an opportunity to expose what really happened at Shadow Valley. William Turner wasn't the only one haunted by that massacre." Nate studied the older man thoughtfully. "Blackwood ruined your reputation when you testified about the altered mineral surveys." "He did his best," Holloway acknowledged with a tight smile. "Branded me unreliable, prone to fanciful interpretations of geological data. I kept my position with the survey, but my assessments have been scrutinized and second-guessed ever since. A minor professional inconvenience compared to what happened to the Comanche, but a constant reminder of Blackwood's reach. And now you're willing to risk what remains of your career, possibly your life, to help us, Sophia asked. My dear, Holloway replied gently, at my age, legacy becomes more important than career. I've lived 15 years knowing I failed those people by not fighting harder against the falsified surveys. This may be my final chance to set things right. Sam cleared his throat, bringing the conversation back to practical matters. Holloway's credentials will get you into the valley, but moving freely to these coordinate points will be challenging. The mining company keeps close watch on visitors, especially those showing interest in areas away from the current operations. We'll need a distraction, Nate concluded, military training asserting itself. Something significant enough to draw attention away from our activities, at least temporarily. I might have a solution for that, offered Jacob Miller, one of the survey team members who had joined their conspiracy. A former mining engineer with his own grievances against Blackwood, he had listened intently throughout the discussions. The supply convoy for the mine comes through twice monthly. Next delivery is scheduled 3 days from now, a major shipment, including blasting powder for expanding the southern shaft. Intercepting it would certainly create a distraction, Sam noted thoughtfully, but also significantly increase the risk. Blackwood would spare no expense hunting those responsible. We wouldn't need to intercept it, Miller clarified. Just delay it in a way that demands attention from the mine security. A rock slide at the right point along the access road, for instance, disruptive but not overtly suspicious. Nate nodded slowly, seeing the potential. With the security force focused on clearing the road and protecting the supplies, we'd have a window to access at least some of the coordinates. It still leaves us with the challenge of appearing legitimate while essentially trespassing across various parts of Blackwood's property, Sophia pointed out. What reason would a geological survey team have for examining those specific locations? Holloway's face lit up with inspiration. Water sources? Of course, I can request permission to conduct hydrological assessments, evaluating how the mining operation is affecting groundwater supplies in the region. It would give us legitimate reason to examine creek beds, natural springs, and water runoff patterns across the property, including several of these coordinates. The plan began taking shape around the fire as night deepened around them. Holloway would request official access for a small team to conduct environmental assessments, with Sophia and Nate posing as his assistants. Miller would arrange the accidental rock slide to delay the supply convoy at a strategic moment, creating their window of opportunity. Sam would remain outside the valley as their contact and emergency backup positioned to alert them if additional Blackwood forces were detected approaching the area. We should be able to reach the mine in 2 days' ride, Holloway calculated. I'll send an official request for access ahead with one of my legitimate assistants, establishing our expected arrival time to coincide with the supply convoy's scheduled delivery. That gives us tomorrow to prepare, Nate noted, mentally cataloging necessary equipment and contingencies. We'll need proper attire and equipment to appear as genuine survey team members. I can provide that, Holloway assured him. The survey maintains standard field kits for all authorized personnel. I have several extras with the official markings. As the discussion continued, Sophia withdrew slightly, her expression pensive as she stared into the fire. Nate noticed her withdrawal and quietly moved to join her. Having second thoughts, he asked softly. She shook her head. Just realizing how close we are after all these years, all my father's planning, we're finally on the verge of reaching Shadow Valley. I almost can't believe it. We're not there yet, Nate cautioned. and retrieving whatever evidence Turner hid will only be the beginning. We still need to free your father from the territorial prison present. The evidence to authorities Blackwood hasn't corrupted. I know, Sophia interrupted gently. One step at a time. That's how my father always approached impossible tasks, break them down into achievable pieces, address each in sequence. Wise man, Nate acknowledged. Sophia turned to study his face in the firelight, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Are you having second thoughts? This isn't your fight. Not really. You could still walk away. It became my fight 15 years ago, Nate replied with quiet certainty. Maybe even before that, when I first agreed to provide intelligence for an operation I didn't fully understand. Everything since has just been delayed consequences. She reached out impulsively, her hand covering his for a brief moment. Whatever happens at Shadow Valley, I want you to know I'm grateful. For your help, your honesty about the past, everything. The simple touch created a connection that transcended words, an acknowledgement of the complex bond that had formed between them through shared danger and painful truths. Nate wanted to respond, but found himself uncharacteristically lost for words. Across the fire, Sam cleared his throat meaningfully, drawing their attention back to the group. We should all get some rest, he suggested. Tomorrow we'll be busy with preparations, and we'll need our wits about us. The gathering dispersed with that practical wisdom, each person seeking their designated sleeping area within the camp. Nate found himself assigned a small tent previously used by one of Holloway's assistants, who had returned to Buffalo Creek earlier that day. Sophia was given similar accommodations on the opposite side of the camp, a deliberate separation that Nate understood was as much for propriety as for practical distribution of watchful eyes throughout the night. Sleep proved elusive despite his physical exhaustion. Nate lay awake, staring at the canvas above him, his mind racing with plans, contingencies, and the growing awareness that their desperate gambit was rapidly approaching its most dangerous phase. Shadow Valley. The place where everything had changed for both him and Sophia. The site of massacre and cover-up that had shaped the subsequent 15 years of their lives in profoundly different ways. Returning there would be more than just a tactical mission. It would be a confrontation with the darkest chapter of his past. Sometime in the deepest hours of the night, Nate finally drifted into troubled sleep, his dreams filled with images of burning lodges and the distant sound of a Comanche woman singing a healing song that could not mend the wounds of that terrible day. Dawn brought clear skies and purposeful activity to the survey camp. Under Holloway's direction, they began assembling the equipment and documentation needed to create convincing identities as geological survey assistants. Sophia proved adept at absorbing the technical terminology and basic procedures, her intelligence and quick study impressing even the veteran geologist. Your father would be proud, Holloway told her as she correctly identified several rock samples he used to test her newly acquired knowledge. He always spoke highly of your aptitude for learning. You knew him well, she asked, hungry for any connection to the father she had not seen in months. As well as anyone could, I suppose, Holloway replied thoughtfully. William was always somewhat reserved, especially after what happened at Shadow Valley. But in the years we corresponded about gathering evidence against Blackwood, I came to respect him deeply. His determination never wavered despite the personal cost. What personal cost? Nate asked, joining their conversation. Holloway glanced between them, seemingly surprised. The isolation, of course. The constant vigilance. Having to raise Sophia alone while looking over his shoulder at every turn. He adjusted his spectacles' expression, somber. And then there was the matter of his health. Sophia went very still. His health? What about it? Holloway's eyebrows rose. You didn't know the respiratory condition he developed after being poisoned during his first imprisonment. Poisoned? Sophia and Nate echoed simultaneously. Shortly after he began gathering evidence, Holloway confirmed, clearly disturbed by their reaction. It was never proven, of course, but William was certain Blackwood had arranged it. He survived, but with permanent damage to his lungs. That's why his work became even more urgent in recent years. He knew his time was limited, regardless of Blackwood's actions. Sophia absorbed this revelation with visible shock, her composure momentarily cracking to reveal the deep personal stake underlying their mission. It wasn't just about justice for Shadow Valley, or even freeing her father from false imprisonment. It was quite possibly a race against his failing health. Nate placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. "All the more reason to succeed," he said quietly. She nodded visibly, gathering her strength before turning back to the task at hand. The moment of vulnerability passed, replaced by the focused determination that had characterized her throughout their journey. The day progressed with methodical preparation. Maps were studied, equipment checked and rechecked, identities and cover stories rehearsed until they could be recited naturally under pressure. By evening, even Nate, with his military attention to detail, was satisfied with their readiness. "Tomorrow, we ride for Shadow Valley," Holloway announced as they gathered for a final planning session. "If all goes according to schedule, we should reach the mining company's checkpoint by late afternoon, spend one night at their visitor accommodations, and begin our survey work the following morning precisely when the supply convoy is due to arrive." "And be delayed," Miller added with quiet confidence. He had spent the day making his own preparations for creating the rock slide that would serve as their distraction. "Remember," Sam cautioned, "your primary objective is retrieving the evidence Turner hid. Anything else? Confrontations, investigations, even gathering additional proof is secondary. Get what you came for and get out." "Agreed," Nate said firmly. "No unnecessary risks or deviations from the plan." He looked pointedly at Sophia as he said this, aware of the emotional impact returning to her childhood home might have. She met his gaze steadily. "I understand the mission parameters, Sergeant Hargrove," she replied, the formal address carrying a hint of irony. "Retrieve the evidence, avoid confrontation, return safely." "Good," Sam nodded, apparently satisfied. "I'll position myself at the rendezvous point we discussed, ready to receive whatever you recover, and move it immediately to the secure location." The secure location was a lawyer's office in Cheyenne, a man Sam vouched for as being both incorruptible and outside Blackwood's sphere of influence. Getting the evidence to him would be the crucial next step after its recovery, one that Sam had insisted on handling personally. "One final matter," Holloway said, reaching into his bag to withdraw a sealed envelope. "This arrived from Cheyenne today via my regular courier. I believe it's for you, Ms. Reyes." Sophia took the envelope with surprise, breaking the seal to reveal a single sheet of paper, covered in what appeared to be random symbols, the same cipher used in Turner's journal. "It's from my father," she confirmed quickly, scanning the message. Her expression shifted from concentration to alarm. "They've moved up his execution date. 2 weeks from now, not with the spring thaw as originally scheduled." "Blackwood's accelerating his timeline," Nate concluded grimly. "He must suspect something's happening." "There's more," Sophia continued, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "My father writes that Blackwood visits him regularly, boasting that he's eliminated all remaining threats to his ascension to governor. The most recent visit included specific mention of a problem in the mountains being permanently resolved." "Read," Nate said. "Blackwood knows he failed, probably assumes he's dead. He'll have dispatched additional men by now." "Which means our window is closing rapidly," Sam noted. If we're going to do this, it has to be now according to plan, with no mistakes. A heavy silence fell over the group, each person contemplating the narrowing path before them and the increasing stakes of their mission. It was Sophia who finally broke the tension, carefully refolding her father's message and tucking it away. "Then we proceed as planned," she said with quiet authority. "Tomorrow we ride for Shadow Valley. One way or another, this ends where it began." No one disagreed. The die was cast, their course set. In the morning, they would embark on the final, most dangerous phase of their journey, returning to the Valley of Shadows where a massacre had occurred and a conspiracy had been born. For Nate, the moment carried a sense of inevitable reckoning. 15 years of evasion and self-imposed exile were coming to an end. Whatever awaited them at Shadow Valley, he knew with bone-deep certainty that he would not be returning to his solitary cabin in the mountains. One way or another, his path would change irrevocably in the days ahead. As the group dispersed to make their final preparations, Nate found himself drawn to the edge of the camp, where the land fell away toward the east, the direction of Shadow Valley, though it lay many miles distant. The quarter moon provided just enough light to outline the rolling landscape, a world of silver and shadow under the winter sky. He sensed, rather than heard, Sophia's approach, her presence becoming familiar enough that he recognized her footsteps and the particular way she moved through space. "Can't sleep?" she asked, stopping beside him. "Just thinking," Nate replied, his gaze still fixed on the distant horizon. "About circles and endings." "Poetic for a former scout," Sophia observed, though her tone held no mockery. "Perhaps. Or just the natural reflection of a man facing the conclusion of a journey 15 years in the making." Nate glanced sideways at her. "Are you afraid?" She considered the question seriously before answering. "Not of dying, if that's what you mean. I made peace with that possibility when I began searching for you." A small smile touched her lips. "I'm more afraid of failing, of coming so close to justice, only to see it slip away." "We won't fail," Nate said with more confidence than he truly felt. "Your father planned too well, and we have resources he couldn't have anticipated. Like Edward Holloway and his convenient survey team." "Like that," Nate agreed. "And Sam's connections, and even Miller's knowledge of mining operations, pieces falling into place, almost as if what? As if we were meant to succeed," Nate finished, slightly embarrassed by the uncharacteristic sentiment. "I'm not usually one for mystical thinking, but there's a pattern to how events have unfolded since you arrived at my cabin." Sophia was silent for a long moment, her profile etched in moonlight as she gazed eastward. "My mother's people believed that spirits guide the paths of the living, especially when seeking justice for great wrongs. That those who died unnaturally through violence or treachery remain connected to this world until balance is restored." "And you? What do you believe?" "I believe in completing what my father started," she replied simply. "In honoring the dead by ensuring their story is told. The rest," she shrugged, "the rest is beyond my understanding." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people bound by tragedy and purpose, watching the night sky above the land that had shaped both their destinies. Tomorrow, they would ride toward confrontation and potential death. But for this moment, there was a strange peace in shared vigilance. "We should try to rest," Nate said finally. "Tomorrow will demand everything we have." Sophia nodded, but made no immediate move to leave. Instead, she turned to face him fully, her expression solemn in the moonlight. "Whatever happens at Shadow Valley, she said quietly. "Know that I have come to respect you, Nathaniel Hargrove, not despite your past, but because of how you have chosen to face it." The simple declaration, delivered without drama or excess emotion, affected Nate more deeply than any flowery speech could have. He inclined his head slightly, accepting both the compliment and the responsibility it carried. "The respect is mutual," he replied. "Your father raised a remarkable woman." A fleeting smile crossed her face, and then she was gone, moving back toward her tent with the same quiet grace that characterized all her actions. Nate remained at his post a while longer, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead and wondering what judgments they had passed on the affairs of men in their ancient patient observation. Morning came clear and cold, the sunrise painting the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold that belied the gravity of their undertaking. Final preparations were made efficiently, each person focused on their assigned responsibilities with minimal conversation. The small party that set out from the survey camp bore little resemblance to the fugitives who had arrived 2 days earlier. Holloway led the way, every inch the government geologist in his official attire, followed by Sophia and Nate, in the practical clothing and equipment of survey assistants. Miller accompanied them for the first portion of the journey, planning to separate later to position himself for creating the diversion at the critical moment. Sam remained at the camp to coordinate communications and prepare for his role in transporting the evidence once recovered. His parting words to Nate had been characteristically blunt. "Don't die out there. I've got enough ghosts keeping me company already." They rode east under the strengthening sun, following a route Holloway assured them would bring them to the main approach to Shadow Valley by late afternoon. The landscape gradually changed as they progressed, transitioning from the rolling hills near Buffalo Creek to more dramatic terrain of rocky outcroppings and deep ravines, the geological formations that had made the region both challenging for settlement and attractive for mineral exploration. Nate found himself increasingly alert as familiar landmarks began to appear, features he had noted during his scouting days before the Shadow Valley operation. Memory overlaid the winter landscape with images from 15 years past, a different season, a different mission, yet the land itself unchanging in its essential character. They paused at midday to rest the horses and review their approach one final time. Holloway spread his official maps across a flat rock, indicating the checkpoint they would need to pass to enter Blackwood's mining property. "Standard procedure is for the foreman to verify our documentation, assign us a company escort, who is really there to monitor our activities and provide basic accommodations at the company building here," he explained, pointing to a structure near the main mining operation. "We'll have the evening and following morning to establish our cover as legitimate surveyors before Miller's diversion occurs." "And the coordinates?" Sophia asked, her finger tracing the circular pattern they had identified in Turner's journal. 3 of the 7 points are within relatively easy access of the central mining complex, using our water survey as justification," Holloway confirmed. "The others would require more extended travel across the property, which might raise suspicions." "So we focus on these 3, Nate decided, marking them mentally. If Turner was thorough, even partial evidence might be sufficient to expose Blackwood. "That's my assessment as well," Holloway agreed. "Better to secure some evidence successfully than risk everything trying to reach all locations." They continued their journey after the brief consultation, Miller separating from the group at a fork in the trail with a simple nod of acknowledgement. His task would take him to a position overlooking the supply road where he would prepare the natural rock slide that would create their critical diversion. As the afternoon waned, they crested a final ridge to reveal their destination spread below them. Shadow Valley, or what remained of it, after 15 years of mining operations. Even from this distance, the transformation was evident. The once pristine valley floor was scarred with excavations, processing facilities, and the sprawling infrastructure of a major silver mining operation. Near the southern end, where the richest deposits had been found, a large industrial complex dominated the landscape, with smoke rising from several chimneys into the clear winter air. Of the Comanche village that had once existed here, no visible trace remained. The cottonwoods that had lined the creek, the trees Nate remembered from that fateful day, had been cleared to make way for mining equipment and outbuildings. The sacred ground had been systematically erased, replaced by an engine of industrial profit. Beside him, Sophia had gone very still, her eyes taking in the transformed landscape with an expression that revealed nothing of her inner thoughts. Only the whiteness of her knuckles on the reins betrayed the emotion she was containing. "I'm sorry," Nate said quietly, inadequate words for the desecration spread before them. She shook her head slightly. "I knew it would be like this. My father described it in his letters." Her voice was steady, controlled. "The place exists now only in memory. What matters is what we came to do." Holloway, who had been watching them both with sympathy, gestured toward the main road that wound down into the valley. "We should proceed. The checkpoint guards will be expecting us, and any delay might raise questions." They rode down into Shadow Valley with the setting sun at their backs, casting long shadows before them across the altered landscape. As they approached the checkpoint, a sturdy gate across the main road with a small guardhouse beside it, Nate felt a growing tension between his shoulder blades, the instinctive wariness of a man entering enemy territory. Two guards stepped out. As they neared, hands resting casually but meaningfully on the revolvers at their hips. Both wore the practical clothing of frontier mining security rather than any formal uniform, but their bearing suggested military background, the kind of men Blackwood would trust to protect his interests. "Halt and state your business," the older guard called, his gaze sweeping over the three riders with professional assessment. Holloway urged his horse forward, slightly producing official-looking documents from his saddlebag. "Edward Holloway, United States Geological Survey. These are my assistants, Thomas Wright and Sarah Bennett." He nodded toward Nate and Sophia, respectively, using the aliases they had established. "We're expected for a hydrological assessment of the mining operation's impact on local water sources." The guard took the papers, examining them with more attention than Nate had anticipated from a simple checkpoint sentry. This was no mere formality. Then Blackwood's security was genuinely vigilant. "Everything appears in order, Mr. Holloway," the guard said finally, "though we weren't informed you'd be bringing assistance this time." "Standard procedure for expanded environmental assessments," Holloway replied smoothly. "The department is increasingly concerned with long-term impacts of resource extraction, particularly regarding groundwater contamination." The guard's expression suggested skepticism, but he nodded reluctantly. "You'll need to check in with Mr. Sullivan at the main office before conducting any surveys. And company policy requires all visitors to remain within designated areas unless accompanied by authorized personnel." "Of course," Holloway agreed amiably. "We're quite familiar with operational protocols at extraction sites. Safety first, as always." After a final evaluating look, the guard stepped aside and signaled for the gate to be opened. "Follow the main road to the administration building, the two-story structure with the company flag. Sullivan should be expecting you." They rode through the checkpoint with carefully maintained composure, following the road into the heart of Blackwood's mining empire. As they progressed, the extent of the operation became increasingly apparent. Dozens of workers moved purposefully among the buildings and equipment, while heavily laden wagons transported ore to the processing facility. The scale was impressive, a testament to the wealth being extracted from land that had once sustained generations of Comanche. "Remember, Nate said quietly as they approached the administration building. "We are survey assistants, competent but unremarkable. Nothing about us should be memorable or noteworthy." Sophia nodded almost imperceptibly, her posture and expression already transformed into the professional detachment of a government employee performing routine duties. It was a remarkable performance, all the more so given the emotional significance this place held for her. The meeting with Sullivan, a harried, officious man, clearly inconvenienced by their arrival, proceeded without incident. He assigned them basic quarters in the visitors' building, arranged for their horses to be stabled, and informed them that an escort would be available the following morning to accompany them during their assessment activities. "Though I must say these repeated government inspections are becoming quite disruptive to our operations," he complained as he concluded the meeting. "Senator Blackwood has assured us that the new territorial regulations will streamline these processes considerably." "The senator is known for his progressive views on resource management," Holloway replied diplomatically. "We're simply fulfilling our current mandate while policy evolves." Sullivan seemed satisfied with this appropriately neutral response and dismissed them to their accommodations with instructions to present themselves at the administration building at 8 o'clock the following morning to meet their escort. The visitors' quarters were Spartan but adequate, a small building with several private rooms originally designed for visiting investors or government inspectors. Sophia was assigned a room on the ground floor, while Nate and Holloway were given adjacent accommodations upstairs. The arrangement was not ideal for communication, but they had anticipated such separation and prepared accordingly. As darkness settled over the valley, Nate stood at his window surveying the mining complex, now illuminated by scattered lanterns and the occasional electric light near the main processing facility. Somewhere beyond those artificial illuminations lay the locations marked in Turner's journal places where evidence of Blackwood's crimes might still be hidden 15 years after the massacre that had set all these events in motion. Tomorrow, they would attempt to reach those locations under the very noses of Blackwood's security force, relying on Miller's diversion and Holloway's official status to shield their true purpose. The risks were enormous, the margin for error non-existent. Yet, after 15 years of evasion and hidden truths, it seemed fitting that Shadow Valley itself would be the stage for the final act of this long-running tragedy. Nate touched the faded scar along his jawline, the mark Caldwell had left when Nate refused to execute the Comanche children. A reminder of the choice he had made that day, the moment when he had finally rejected complicity in atrocity, however belatedly. "Full circle," he murmured to the darkness, echoing his conversation with Sophia the previous night. Whatever happened tomorrow, something would end here in Shadow Valley, a chapter closing on 15 years of secrets and silent ghosts. Sleep came fitfully that night, his dreams filled with fragments of memory and imagined confrontations. When dawn finally arrived, Nate rose feeling more exhausted than rested, but with a crystalline clarity of purpose that transcended physical discomfort. Today, they would attempt to recover Turner's hidden evidence. Today, they would strike at the heart of Blackwood's power and secrets. Today, if fortune favored them, they would take the first concrete step toward justice for Shadow Valley. And if they failed, if Blackwood's forces discovered their true purpose, or the evidence proved insufficient, then at least they would have made the attempt. Better to die in pursuit of truth than live with comfortable lies, as Turner himself had demonstrated through 15 years of patient, dangerous work. With that thought firmly in mind, Nate prepared himself for whatever the day might bring, knowing only that by its end, the long shadow of Shadow Valley would either be diminished or claim yet more victims in its darkness.